ನಾನು ಅದನ್ನು ಕಳೆದ ವರ್ಷ ತೆಗೆದಾಕಿದೆ. ಡೀಮ್ಡ್ ಎಕ್ಸ್ಪೆಂಡಿಚರ್ 7D ಅನ್ನೋದನ್ನೇ ಡ್ರಾಪ್ ಮಾಡೋದು, ಅಮೆಂಡ್ಮೆಂಟ್ ತಗೋಬೋದು, SCP TSP ಆಕ್ಟಿಗೆ ತಗೋಬೋದು ಮಾಡೋದು. ಇವ್ರು ಯಾಕೆ ಮಾಡಲಿಲ್ಲ? 4 ವರ್ಷ ಇದ್ರಲ್ಲ, ಯಾಕೆ ಮಾಡಲಿಲ್ಲ? ನೀವು ಡಿಪೆಂಡ್ ಮಾಡ್ಕೋತೀರಾ ಡೀಮ್ಡ್ ಎಕ್ಸ್ಪೆಂಡಿಚರ್ನ? ಯು ಕಾಂಟ್ ಡಿಫೆಂಡ್ ಇಟ್. ಕಾಳಜಿ ಇರೋರು ಡಿಫೆಂಡ್ ಮಾಡಿ 4 ವರ್ಷ ಬೇಕಾಗಿತ್ತಾ ತೆಗಿಯಕ್ಕೆ? ತೆಗೆದಾಕ್ಲಿಲ್ಲ. ಆಮೇಲೆ
ಆಯ್ತು, ಬೆಲ್ಲದ್ ಯಾಕೆ ಮಾತಾಡ್ತೀರಿ? ಸರಿ, ಪ್ರತಿಯೊಂದು ಕೊಡ್ತಾರೆ, ಆಯ್ತು. ಕೌಂಟರ್ ನೋಡಿ, ಏಳಿಗೆ ಪ್ರತಿಯೊಂದು ಕೂಡ ಕೌಂಟರ್ ಇರ್ತದೆ. ಆಯ್ತು, ಅದರ ಮುಂಚೆ ಮ್ಯಾನಿಫೆಸ್ಟೋ ತುಂಬಾ ಹೇಳ್ತೀರಿ, ಆಗಿದೆ ಅಲ್ಲ? ಇಲ್ಲಲ್ಲ, ಅದ್ರ ಬಗ್ಗೆ ಮಾತಾಡಿ ಪ್ರಯೋಜನ ಇಲ್ಲ. ಅದಕ್ಕಿಂತ ಮುಂಚೆ 3 ವರ್ಷ ಇದ್ರೆ ಯಾಕೆ ಮಾಡ್ಲಿಲ್ಲ ಅಂತ ಕೇಳುವಂತದ್ದು.
2013ರಲ್ಲಿ ಇವ್ರು ಆಕ್ಟ್ ತಂದಿದ್ದು ಹೌದು. 2013ರಿಂದ 2018 ತನಕ ಇವರೇ ಇದ್ರು. ಆ ಡೀನ್ ಯಾಕೆ ತೆಗಿಲಿಲ್ಲ ಇವರು?
ಓಕೆ,
ನಿಮ್ ಕಾಲದಲ್ಲಿ ಆಗಿದ್ದು, ಯಾಕೆ ತಂದಿದ್ದು ನೀವೇ? ಈಗ ತೆಗಿಬೇಕು ಅಂತ ನಮ್ಮನ್ನು ಡಿಮ್ಯಾಂಡ್ ಮಾಡಿದ್ರೆ ನೀವು. ಈಗ ನೀವು ಈಗ ತೆಗ್ದಿರ್ಬೋದು, ಅದನ್ನು ಮೀರಿ ಹೆಂಗ್ ಡೈವರ್ಟ್ ಮಾಡಿದಿರಿ ಈಗ ನೀವು? ನಾನು ಅದಕ್ಕೆ 2 ನಿಮಿಷ ಈಲ್ಡ್ ಆದ್ರೆ ಹೇಳ್ತೀನಿ ಅಂತ ಹೇಳ್ತಾ, ನಾನು ಮುಖ್ಯಮಂತ್ರಿಗಳಿಗೆ ಡಿಸ್ಟರ್ಬ್ ಮಾಡಲ್ಲ. ನೀವು ಒಂದ್ ಸೈಡ್ ಮಾತ್ರ ಮಾತಾಡ್ತಾ ಹೋಗಿ ಸತ್ಯನ ಮುಚ್ಚಿಡಬಾರ್ದು.
ಸರಿ, ಈಗ
ಹೇಳಿದ್ದು ಸತ್ಯ ಕೈಯಾಗಿರುತ್ತೆ, ಸತ್ಯ ಕೈಯಾಗಿರುತ್ತೆ.
ಆಯ್ತು, ಈಗ ನೋಡಿ ಸಬ್ಜೆಕ್ಟ್ ಬಂದ್ರೆ ರಿಪ್ಲೈ ಆಗ್ಲಿ ಅವ್ರೆ. ಆಯ್ತು, ಮತ್ತೆ ಮಾತಾಡಿ ನೀವು, ರಿಪ್ಲೈ ಎಲ್ಲ ಆಗ್ಲಿ.
ಮಾನ್ಯ ಅಧ್ಯಕ್ಷರೇ, ಇಡೀ ದೇಶದಲ್ಲಿ SC ST ಜನಸಂಖ್ಯೆ ಇರ್ತಕ್ಕಂಥದ್ದು ದೇಶದಲ್ಲಿ 2011 ಜನಗಣತಿ ಪ್ರಕಾರ 16.6% SC, 8.6% ST. Both put together 25.2% SC ST ಇದ್ದಾರೆ. ಅವ್ರ ಜನಸಂಖ್ಯೆಗೆ ಅನುಗುಣವಾಗಿ ಖರ್ಚು ಮಾಡಬೇಕಲ್ಲ ಹಣನ, ಅದು ಮಾಡಲಿಲ್ಲ. ಎಷ್ಟು ಮಾಡಿರೋದು? 2.7% ಮಾಡಿರೋದು. ನಾವು 7.46 ಮಾಡಿದ್ದೀವಿ, ನೀವು 2.87% ಮಾಡಿದ್ದೀರಿ. ಆಮೇಲೆ ಈ ಡೀಮ್ಡ್ ಎಕ್ಸ್ಪೆಂಡಿಚರ್ ಇತ್ತಲ್ಲ 7D, ನಾವು ಸುನಿಲ್ ಈಗ ಹೇಳಿದ್ದಾರೆ, ನೀವು ಯಾಕೆ ತೆಗಿಲಿಲ್ಲ? ಯಾಕಂತಂದ್ರೆ ನಾವು ಆಗ್ತಾನೆ ಕಾನೂನು ಮಾಡಿದ್ದು, ಅದರ ಸಾಧಕ ಬಾಧಕಗಳನ್ನು ನೋಡ್ಕೊಂಡು ತೆಗಿಯೋಣ ಅಂತೇಳಿ ತೆಗಿರ್ಲಿಲ್ಲ. ಹೌದೌದಪ್ಪ, ತೆಗ್ದಿದ್ದ ನಿಜ, ತೆಗ್ದಿರ್ಲಿಲ್ಲ
ಸರ್. ಒಂದೇ ನಿಮಿಷ ನಿಮ್ ಆಕ್ಟ್ ಅಲ್ಲಿ ಹೇಳ್ಬಿಡ್ತೀನಿ ನಾನು. 1 ನಿಮಿಷ ಈಲ್ಡ್ ಆಗಿ ನೀವು, 1 ನಿಮಿಷ ಈಲ್ಡ್ ಆಗಿ ಸರ್, 1 ನಿಮಿಷ ಈಲ್ಡ್ ಆಗಿ ಸರ್. ನಿಮ್ಮ ಆಕ್ಟ್ ಅಲ್ಲಿ 7D ತೆಗ್ದಿರೋದು ನಾನು ಒಪ್ಕೋತೀನಿ. 7D ನಾನು ತೆಗ್ದಿದ್ರಿ ನೀವು. 7D ನಮ್ಮ ಸರ್ಕಾರದಲ್ಲಿ, ನಿಮ್ ಸರ್ಕಾರ ಇದ್ದಾಗ 7D ಮಾಡಿದ್ದು, ಸಾಧಕ ಬಾಧಕ ನೋಡಿದ್ರಿ, ಎಲ್ಲ ಒಪ್ಕೋತೀನಿ ನಾನು. ನೀವು 7C ನಲ್ಲಿ ಏನ್ ಹೇಳ್ತೀರಿ? ಸಾಮಾನ್ಯ ಸಾಮಾಜಿಕ ವಲಯ ಸ್ಕೀಮ್ಗಳು ಎಂದರೆ ಉಪಯೋಜನೆಗಳಲ್ಲಿ ಸೇರಿರುವ ಶಿಕ್ಷಣ, ಆರೋಗ್ಯ, ಮಹಿಳಾ ಮತ್ತು ಮಕ್ಕಳು, ಕಾರ್ಮಿಕ, ದೈಹಿಕ ವಿಕಲಚೇತನರ ಸ್ಕೀಮುಗಳು, ಅನುಸೂಚಿತ ಜಾತಿಗಳು, ಅನುಸೂಚಿತ ಪಂಗಡಗಳ ವ್ಯಕ್ತಿಗೆ, ಕುಟುಂಬಗಳಿಗೆ ಪ್ರಯೋಜನವಾಗಿದ್ದಂದರೆ ಸ್ಕೀಮಿನ ವೆಚ್ಚವನ್ನು ಅನುಸೂಚಿತ ಜಾತಿಗಳು, ಪಂಗಡ ಜನಸಂಖ್ಯೆಯ ಪ್ರಮಾಣಕ್ಕನುಗುಣವಾಗಿ ಇದನ್ನು ಬಳಸತಕ್ಕದ್ದು ಅಂತ ನೀವು ನಲ್ಲಿ ಹೇಳ್ತೀರಿ. ನೀವು ಎಲ್ಲಿ ಸೀನಲ್ಲಿ ಕೊಡ್ಬೇಕಾದ್ರೆ ನಿಮ್ದೇ ಉತ್ತರದಲ್ಲಿ ಏನ್ ಹೇಳಿದಿರಿ ಅಂತಂದ್ರೆ, ಸರ್ ಒಂದ್ ನಿಮಿಷ ಈಲ್ಡ್ ಆಗಿ ಸರ್, ಒಂದೇ ನಿಮಿಷ. ನಿಮ್ ಡಾಕ್ಯುಮೆಂಟ್ ಕೊಡ್ತಾ ಇದೀನಿ, ಈಲ್ಡ್ ಆಗದಲ್ಲಿ ಅರ್ಜೆಂಟ್ ಮಾಡಿದ್ರೆ ನೀವು ಹೆಂಗಾಗುತ್ತೆ?
ಇಲ್ಲ, ಅರ್ಜೆಂಟ್ ಏನಿಲ್ಲ ಸರ್.
ನಿಮ್ದೇ ಯಾವ್ದು ಪರಿಷತ್ ಸಭೆಯಲ್ಲಿರುವಂತ ಸರ್ಕಾರಿ ದಾಖಲೆ. ಈ ಸರ್ಕಾರಿ ದಾಖಲೆ ಏನ್ ಹೇಳ್ತೀರಿ ನೀವು? ಅನ್ನಭಾಗ್ಯ ಯೋಜನೆ ಅಡಿನಲ್ಲಿ SEP ನಲ್ಲಿ ನಿಗದಿಪಡಿಸಿದ ಅನುದಾನ 1855.88 ಕೋಟಿ, TSP ನಲ್ಲಿ 785.56 ಕೋಟಿ ಅಂತ ಹೇಳ್ತೀರಿ. ಆಮೇಲೆ ಏನದ್ರಲ್ಲಿ ಹೇಳ್ತೀರಿ ಅಂತಂದ್ರೆ, ಪರಿಶಿಷ್ಟ ಜಾತಿ ಪಂಗಡಗಳ ಫಲಾನುಭವಿಗಳ ನಿಖರ ಸಂಖ್ಯೆ ಮತ್ತು ವಿವರಗಳನ್ನು ಸಲ್ಲಿಸಲು ಸೂಚಿಸಿದ್ದರೂ ಇದುವರೆಗೂ ಮಾಹಿತಿ ಒದಗಿಸಿರುವುದಿಲ್ಲ ಅಂತ ನೀವೇ ಹೇಳ್ಕೊಂಡು ಇದನ್ನ SCP TSP ಒಂದು ಗ್ಯಾರಂಟಿ ಯೋಜನೆ ಡೈವರ್ಟ್ ಮಾಡ್ಕೊಂಡ್ರೆ ಹೆಂಗಾಗುತ್ತೆ? ಅದ್ರ ಮುಂದೆ ಇನ್ನೊಂದು ಹೇಳ್ತೀರಿ, ಬಹಳ ಆಶ್ಚರ್ಯ. ಅದ್ರಲ್ಲಿ ಮುಂದೆ ಹೇಳ್ತೀರಿ, ಶಕ್ತಿ ಯೋಜನೆಗೆ SCP ನಲ್ಲಿ 1001 ಕೋಟಿ ರೂಪಾಯಿ, TSP ನಲ್ಲಿ 450 ಕೋಟಿ ರೂಪಾಯಿ. ಅದ್ರಲ್ಲಿ ಶರ ಏನ್ ಹೇಳ್ತೀರಿ? ಫಲಾನುಭವಿಗಳ
28 लाख की गाड़ी है वैसे भी मेरी पर्सनालिटी के साथ मैच नहीं हो रही है
ब्रो। बस इतनी आसानी से ड्रीम कार के सपने को स्किप कर दिया? सपनों को स्किप नहीं, सिप करो।
म्यूचुअल फंड निवेश बाजार जोखिमों के अधीन है। योजना से जुड़े सभी दस्तावेजों को ध्यान से पढ़ें।
ಒಂದು ಕ್ವಶನ್ ಕೇಳ್ತಾರೆ, ಪರಿಶಿಷ್ಟ ಜಾತಿ ಪಂಗಡಗಳ ಕಲ್ಯಾಣಕ್ಕಾಗಿ ಮೀಸಲಾದ ಅನುದಾನದಲ್ಲಿ 2024 ಹಂತಕ್ಕೆ ಎಷ್ಟು ಮೊತ್ತವನ್ನು ಸರ್ಕಾರದ ಗ್ಯಾರಂಟಿ ಯೋಜನೆಗಳ ಅನುಷ್ಠಾನಕ್ಕಾಗಿ ಬಳಕೆ ಮಾಡಲಾಗಿದೆ ಅಂತ ಕ್ವಶನ್ ಕೇಳ್ತಾರೆ. ಸರ್ಕಾರ ಉತ್ತರ ಕೊಡುತ್ತೆ, ನಾನಲ್ಲ, ನಿಮ್ ಸರ್ಕಾರನೇ ಕೊಟ್ಟರೆ.
ಮತ್ತೆ ಕೇಳ್ಬೋದಲ್ಲ.
ಅದರಲ್ಲಿ ಗೃಹಲಕ್ಷ್ಮಿಗೆ ಒಟ್ಟು ಟೋಟಲ್ 7,713 ಕೋಟಿ ರೂಪಾಯಿಯನ್ನು ಹಂಚಿಕೆ ಮಾಡಿದೆ. TSP ನಲ್ಲಿ 3,430 ಕೋಟಿ ರೂಪಾಯಿ ಹಂಚಿಕೆ ಮಾಡಲಾಗಿದೆ ಅಂತೇಳಿ ನೀವು ನಿಮ್ಮ ಉತ್ತರದಲ್ಲೇ ಕೊಡ್ತೀರಿ. ಬಹಳ ಇನ್ನೊಂದು ಮುಂದೋಗಿ ಹೇಳ್ಬೇಕು ಅಂತ
ಚರ್ಚೆ ಬೇರೆ. ಸುನೀಲ್
ಒಂದ್ ನಿಮಿಷ
ಹೇಳಿದ್ರಲ್ಲ,
ಒಂದ್ ನಿಮಿಷ ಹೇಳಬಿಡ್ತೀನಿ.
ಮಾನ್ಯ ಅಧ್ಯಕ್ಷರೇ, ಇವ್ರಿಗೆ ಅವಕಾಶ ಕೊಟ್ಟಿತ್ತು,
ಅವಕಾಶ
ಹೇಳ್ಬೋದಿತ್ತಲ್ಲ.
ಯಾವಾಗ ಹೇಳ್ಬೇಕಾಗಿತ್ತು? ನಾವು ಸರ್ಕಾರ ಇದನ್ನ ಡೈವರ್ಟ್ ಮಾಡಿದಿರಿ ಅಂತ ಒಪ್ಕೊಂಡಿದಿರಿ ಅಂತ ನಾವು ಮನಸ್ಸಲ್ಲಿ ಒಪ್ಕೊಂಡಿಲ್ಲ ಅಂತ ವಾದ ಮಾಡಿದ್ರೆ,
ಹೌದು
ಒಪ್ಕೊಂಡಿಲ್ಲ ಅಂತ ವಾದ ಮಾಡ್ತಿದಿರಲ್ಲ.
ಹೌದು
ಸರ್, ಮಾನ್ಯ ಅಧ್ಯಕ್ಷರೇ, ಇಲ್ಲಿ ಹೇಳ್ತಾರೆ ಕೇಳಿ.
ಅಲ್ಲ, ಈಗ ಚರ್ಚೆ ಬೇರೆ ಸುನೀಲ್. ಈಗ ಯಾಕಂತ ರಿಪ್ಲೈ ಆಗ್ಲಿ. ಈಗ
ಸೆಕ್ಷನ್ ಯೋಜನೆ ಅಡಿ ಒಂದು ನಿಮಿಷ ಲಾಸ್ಟ್ ಮುಗಿಸ್ಬಿಡ್ತೀನಿ. 7 ಸೆಕ್ಷನ್ ಸಿ ಯೋಜನೆ ಅಡಿನಲ್ಲಿ SCP TSP ಯೋಜನೆ ಅನುದಾನವನ್ನು ಗ್ಯಾರಂಟಿ ಯೋಜನೆಗಳಿಗೆ ಸರ್ಕಾರ ಬಳಸಿಕೊಂಡಿರುವುದು ನಿಜ ಎಂದು ಕರ್ನಾಟಕ ಪರಿಶಿಷ್ಟ ಜಾತಿ ಪಂಗಡಗಳ ಅಲೆಮಾರಿ ಅರೆಮಾಲಿ ಸಮುದಾಯಗಳ ಅಭಿವೃದ್ಧಿ ಅಧ್ಯಕ್ಷೆ ಪಲ್ಲವಿ ಹೇಳಿದರು ಅಂತಾನೆ ಪ್ರೆಸ್ ಸ್ಟೇಟ್ಮೆಂಟ್ ಇದೆ. ಸರ್ಕಾರ ಅಫಿಷಿಯಲಿ ಒಪ್ಕೊಳ್ಳುತ್ತೆ. ಇಲ್ಲಿ ಮುಖ್ಯಮಂತ್ರಿಗಳು ಹೇಳ್ತಾರೆ, ನಾವು ಡೈವರ್ಟ್ ಮಾಡಿಲ್ಲ, ನಾವು DN ಡೈವರ್ಟ್ ಕ್ಲೋಸ್ ಮಾಡಿದ್ವಿ, ಸಿ ಪ್ರಕಾರ ಮಾಡಿಲ್ವಾಗಾರೆ.
ಆಯ್ತು, ಕೂತ್ಕೊಳ್ಳಿ.
ಗ್ಯಾರಂಟಿ ಯೋಜನೆಗಳಿಗೆ
ಈಗ ಉತ್ತರ ಕೊಡ್ತಾರೆ. ಉತ್ತರ ಕೊಡ್ತಾರೆ. ಈಗ
ಅದನ್ನ ಕೇಳ್ತಾ ಇರೋದು.
ಆಯ್ತು, ಉತ್ತರ ಕೊಡ್ತಾರೆ. ಕೇಳಿದಾಗ ಉತ್ತರ ಕೊಡ್ತಾರೆ. ಈಗ
ಅಧ್ಯಕ್ಷರೇ, SC ST 25% ಜನ ಅಲ್ಲಿ ಇದ್ದಾರೆ ಅಂತ ನಾನು ಹೇಳ್ತಾ ಇದ್ದೀನಿ. ದೇರ್ ಇಸ್ 25%. ಆಮೇಲೆ ಬಸ್ ನಲ್ಲಿ ಒಂದ್ ನಿಮಿಷ, ಬಸ್ ನಲ್ಲಿ ಯಾವ ಹೆಣ್ಮಕ್ಳು ಹೋಗ್ತಾರೆ ಅಲ್ಲಿ ಜಾತಿ ನೋಡಿ ಇದನ್ನ ಕೊಡ್ಲಿಕ್ಕೆ ಆಗಲ್ಲ. ಅರೆ, ಬಸ್ನಾಗ ಜಾತಿ ಹೇಳ್ತಾರ. ಆದ್ರೆ ಏನಪ್ಪಾ, ಇಟ್ ಇಸ್ 18% ಜನ ಇದಾರಂತ ಆ ಹಣ ಕೊಟ್ಟಿರ್ತಾರೆ ಹೊರತು ಎಷ್ಟು ಜನ ಪ್ರಯಾಣ ಮಾಡಿದ್ರು SCಗಳು, ಎಷ್ಟು ಜನ ಇದನ್ನ ಮಾಡಿದ್ರು ಅಂತ ಗೊತ್ತಾಗಲ್ಲ ಬಸ್ಸಲ್ಲಿ. ಅಲ್ಲಿ ಗೊತ್ತಾಗಬಹುದು.
ರಾಯರೆಡ್ಡಿ ಅವರೇ, ನಿಮ್ದೇ ಆಕ್ಟ್ ನಲ್ಲಿ ಮಾತಾಡ್ತೀರಿ. ಒಂದೇ ನಿಮಿಷ ರಾಯರೆಡ್ಡಿ ಹೇಳಿದಕ್ಕೆ ಸತ್ಯ ಕೈಯಾಗಿದೆ ಅನ್ನೋ ಕಾರಣಕ್ಕೆ ಬೇಜಾರು ಮಾಡ್ಕೋಬೇಡಿ. ನೀವು ಇದರಲ್ಲಿ ನಿಮ್ಮ ಆಕ್ಟ್ ನಲ್ಲಿ ಸೆಕೆಂಡ್ ನಲ್ಲಿ ಬಿ ನಲ್ಲಿ ಏನ್ ಹೇಳ್ತೀರಿ ಅಂತ ಕೇಳಿದ್ರೆ,
ಸುನಿಲ್ ಕುಮಾರ್ ಅವರೇ
ಕೇಳಿದ್ರೆ
ದಯವಿಟ್ಟು ಕೂರಿ ಆಮೇಲೆ ಕ್ಲಾರಿಫಿಕೇಶನ್ ಕೇಳಿ.
ಕ್ಲಾರಿಫಿಕೇಶನ್ ಸರ್,
ಹೌದು, ಅವ್ರಿಗೆ ಉತ್ತರ ಕೊಡಕ್ ಬಿಡಿ. ಉತ್ತರ ಕೊಟ್ಟ ಆದ್ಮೇಲೆ ಕ್ಲಾರಿಫಿಕೇಶನ್ ಕೇಳಿ.
ಜಾತಿ ಅನುಸೂಚಿತ ಬುಡಕಟ್ಟು ಪ್ರಮಾಣಗಳ ಸೌಲಭ್ಯಗಳ ಜೊತೆಗೆ ನೋಡಲ್ ಇಲಾಖೆಗೆ ಫಲಾನುಭವಿಗಳ ಪಟ್ಟಿಯನ್ನು ಒದಗಿಸಿದ್ದರೆ ಮಾತ್ರ ಈ ಯೋಜನೆಯನ್ನು ರಾಜಸ್ವ ಯೋಜನೆ ಎಂದು ವರ್ಗೀಕರಿಸಬಹುದಾಗಿದೆ ಅಂತೇಳಿ ಆಕ್ಟ್ ನಲ್ಲಿ ಹೇಳ್ತೀರಿ. ಕೊಡಿ ಪಟ್ಟಿ. ಹಂಗಾರೆ ಶಕ್ತಿ ಯೋಜನೆಯಲ್ಲಿ ಯಾರು SC/STಗಳಿದ್ರು ಅಂತ?
ಶಕ್ತಿ ಯೋಜನೆಯಲ್ಲಿ ಪಟ್ಟಿ ಕೊಡಕ್ಕೆ ಅಲ್ಲಿ ಹೋಗಿ ಜಾತಿ ಬರ್ಕೊಳಕ್ಕಾಗಲ್ಲ. ಬಸ್ಸಲ್ಲಿ
ಅಂತ ಹೇಳಿ
ಬಸ್ಸಲ್ಲಿ ಜಾತಿ ಬರೆಯಕ್ಕಾಗಲ್ಲ. ಎಲ್ಲ ಒಟ್ಟಿಗೆ ಹೋಗ್ತಾರೆ. ನೋಡ್ರಿ, ಎಲ್ಲ ಒಟ್ಟಿಗೆ ಹೋಗ್ತಾರೆ. ಅಲ್ಲಿ ಹೋಗಿ ಯಾವ್ಯಾವ ನೀನ್ ಯಾವ ಜಾತಿಯರು ಯಾವ ಜಾತಿ ಕೂತಿದ್ದೀರಿ ಅಂತ ಬರ್ಕೊಳಕ್ ಆಗ್ತಲ್ಲ. ಎಲ್ಲ ಒಟ್ಟಿಗೆ ಹೋಗ್ತಾರೆ. ಒಟ್ಟಾರೆ ಕರ್ನಾಟಕ ರಾಜ್ಯದಲ್ಲಿರೋ SC ST ಜನಕ್ಕೆ ಅದರ ಇದು ಸೇರಿದೆ. ಅದು ಸೇರಿದೆ. ಅದು ಅವ್ರಿಗೆ ಅನುಕೂಲ ಆಗ್ಲಿ, ಅಲ್ಲಿ ಹೋಗ್ತಾರೆ. ಅಲ್ಲಿ ಬಸ್ಗೆ ಹೋದಾಗ ನೀನ್ ಯಾವ ಜಾತಿ ಅಂತ ಕೇಳಕ್ ಆಗಲ್ಲ. ಅದನ್ನ ಮಾಡಕ್ ಆಗೋದಿಲ್ಲ. ಒಟ್ಟಾರೆ ಅವರಿಗೆ ಶಕ್ತಿ ಯೋಜನೆಯಲ್ಲಿ ಆ ಸಮಾಜದ ಹೆಣ್ಮಕ್ಳು ಹೋಗೇ ಹೋಗ್ಯಾರ. ಅವ್ರಿಗೆ ಅನುಕೂಲ ಆಗಿದೆ. ಅವ್ರು ಒಪ್ಕೊಂಡ್ಯಾರ.
ಮಾನ್ಯ ಅಧ್ಯಕ್ಷರೇ, ನಾನು ಈಲ್ಡ್ ಆಗಲ್ಲ
ಇನ್ ಮುಂದೆ ಈಲ್ಡ್ ಅವರು ಉತ್ತರ ಹೇಳಿ. ರೇ ಸ್ವಾಮಿ ಹೇಳ್ತಾರೆ, ಅವರು ಉತ್ತರ ಹೇಳಾದ್ಮೇಲೆ ಕ್ಲಾರಿಫಿಕೇಶನ್ಗೆ ಟೈಮ್ ಇರುತ್ತೆ. ದಯಮಾಡಿ ಎಲ್ಲ ಪಾಯಿಂಟ್ಸ್ ಗುರ್ತಾಕೊಂಡ್ರೆ ಆಮೇಲೆ ಹೇಳಿ.
ನಾನು ಮಧ್ಯೆ ಹೇಳ್ತೀನಿ,
ಆಮೇಲೆ ಕೇಳಿ, ಪಾಯಿಂಟ್ಸ್ ಗುರ್ತಾಕಿ ಕೇಳಿ, ಆಮೇಲೆ ಕೇಳಿ.
ಪಾಯಿಂಟ್ ರೈಸ್ ಮಾಡಬೇಕು. ನಾವು ಇಟ್ ಇಸ್ ನಾಟ್ ಡಿಸೆನ್ಸಿ ಅಂತ ಹೇಳಿ ಕೂತ್ಕೊಂಡಿದ್ದೀವಿ ನಾವು. ಮೊನ್ನೆ ಅಧ್ಯಕ್ಷರೇ 5.25% ಇದ್ದಾರೆ ಕೇಂದ್ರ ಸರ್ಕಾರದಲ್ಲಿ. ಇಡೀ ದೇಶದಲ್ಲಿ ಪರಿಶಿಷ್ಟ ಜಾತಿಯವರು 16.6%, ಆಮೇಲೆ ಪರಿಶಿಷ್ಟ ವರ್ಗದವರು 8.6%, ಒಟ್ಟು 25.2%. ಇದನ್ನ ಇಷ್ಟು ಪ್ರಮಾಣದಲ್ಲಿ ಇರುವಾಗ 25.2% ಇರುವಾಗ ಖರ್ಚು ಮಾಡಿದ್ದು ಬರೀ 2.87%. 70 ಬಗ್ಗೆ ಬಹಳ ದಿನಗಳಿಂದ ಒತ್ತಾಯ ಇತ್ತು. ನಾನು ಹಿಂದೆ ಚೀಫ್ ಮಿನಿಸ್ಟರ್ ಆಗಿದ್ದವರು ಕೂಡ ಒತ್ತಾಯ ಇತ್ತು, ಆಮೇಲೆ ಈಗಲೂ ಕೂಡ ಒತ್ತಾಯ ಇತ್ತು. ಅದಕ್ಕೋಸ್ಕರನೇ ಕಳೆದ ವರ್ಷ ಇದನ್ನು ಅಮೆಂಡ್ಮೆಂಟ್ ಮಾಡಿ ತೆಗೆದಾಕ್ಬಿಟ್ಟು ಒತ್ತಾಯ ಇದ್ದು 70ಗೆ. 7C ನಾವು ಇನ್ನೂ ಡ್ರಾಪ್ ಮಾಡಿಲ್ಲ, ಅದನ್ನು ಮಾಡೋಕ್ಕೂ ಬರಲ್ಲ. ಈಗಾಗಲೇ ಅಧ್ಯಕ್ಷರು ಹೇಳಿದ ರೀತಿಯಲ್ಲಿ ಶಕ್ತಿ ಯೋಜನೆಯಲ್ಲಿ ಸುಮಾರು ಬಹಳ ದಿನ, ಒಂದು ದಿನಕ್ಕೆ 50 ಲಕ್ಷ ಜನ ಪ್ರಯಾಣ ಮಾಡ್ತಾರೆ. 50 ಲಕ್ಷ ಜನನು ನೀವು ಯಾವ್ಯಾವ ಜಾತಿಗೆ ಸೇರಿದ್ದೀರಿ ಅಂತ ಕೇಳಕ್ಕಾಗತ್ತಾ?
ಆಗಲ್ಲ.
ಪ್ರಾಕ್ಟಿಕಲಿ ನಾಟ್ ಪಾಸಿಬಲ್. ಆಮೇಲೆ 19-20ರಲ್ಲಿ ಯಾರಿದ್ದವರು ಅಧಿಕಾರದಲ್ಲಿ ನೀವಿದ್ದವರು, ಅವತ್ತು ಡೀಮ್ಡ್ ವೆಚ್ಚ ಅಂತ ಮಾಡಿರೋದು ನೀವು 1400 ಕೋಟಿ. 20-21ರಲ್ಲಿ 2008 ಕೋಟಿ, 21-22ರಲ್ಲಿ 2613 ಕೋಟಿ, 22-23ರಲ್ಲಿ 2412 ಕೋಟಿ. ಇದು ಪರಿಶಿಷ್ಟ ಜಾತಿ ಪರಿಶಿಷ್ಟ ವರ್ಗದವರು ಖರ್ಚು ಮಾಡಿದಂಥ ಹಣ ಅಲ್ಲ. ಅದಕ್ಕೋಸ್ಕರನೇ ತೆಗೆದಾಕಿರೋದು ನಾವು. ಇದನ್ನ ಮಾನ್ಯ ಸದಸ್ಯರು ಅರ್ಥ ಮಾಡ್ಕೋಬೇಕು ಅಂತಕ್ಕಂಥ ಮಾತುಗಳನ್ನು ಹೇಳಲಿಕ್ಕೆ ಬಯಸ್ತೇನೆ. ಕೇಂದ್ರ ಸರ್ಕಾರ ಯಾವುದಕ್ಕೆಲ್ಲ ಖರ್ಚು ಮಾಡಿದೆ, ನಾನು ಮಾನ್ಯ ಅಧ್ಯಕ್ಷರೇ ಈಗ ಇದನ್ನೆಲ್ಲ ಬಜೆಟ್ ಮೇಲೆ ಉತ್ತರ ಕೊಡುವಾಗ ಹೇಳ್ತೀನಿ. ಯಾವ್ಯಾವ ಕೇಂದ್ರ ಸರ್ಕಾರ ಯಾವ್ಯಾವ್ದು ಖರ್ಚು ಮಾಡಿದೆ, ಇವರು ರಾಜ್ಯ ಸರ್ಕಾರ ಯಾವ್ದು ಖರ್ಚು ಮಾಡಿದೆ, ಮತ್ತು ಸುನೀಲ್ ಕೇಳಿದ್ರಲ್ಲ ನೀವು ಯಾವುದಕ್ಕೆ ಡೈವರ್ಟ್ ಮಾಡಿದ್ದೀರಿ ಹಣನ, ಅದೆಲ್ಲಕ್ಕೂ ಉತ್ತರ ಕೊಡ್ತೀನಿ. ನಾನು ಎಲ್ಲಕ್ಕೂ ಉತ್ತರ ಕೊಡ್ತೀನಿ. ಸೊ ನಾವು ಏನು ಮಾಡಿದ್ದೀವಿ ಅನ್ನೋದನ್ನ ನೀವು ತಿಳ್ಕೋಬೇಕಾಗುತ್ತೆ. ಪರಿಶಿಷ್ಟ ಜಾತಿ ಪರಿಶಿಷ್ಟ ವರ್ಗದವರಿಗೆ ಏನು ಮಾಡಿದ್ದೀವಿ? 2013ರಲ್ಲಿ ಆಕ್ಟ್ ತಗೊಬಂದು ಬಡ್ತಿ ಮೀಸಲಾತಿ ಯಾವ್ದಾದ್ರು ರಾಜ್ಯದಲ್ಲಿ ಮಾಡಿದ್ದೀರ? ಬಡ್ತಿ ಮೀಸಲಾತಿಯನ್ನ ನ್ಯಾಯಾಲಯಗಳ ಆದೇಶ ಮೀರಿ ಕಾಯ್ದೆಗಳನ್ನು ತಂದಿರತಕ್ಕಂಥದ್ದು ಇದೆಯಾ? ಯಾಕೆ ಮಾಡಿಲ್ಲ? ಕರ್ನಾಟಕ ಇಸ್ ದಿ ಓನ್ಲಿ ಸ್ಟೇಟ್ ಬಡ್ತಿ ಮೀಸಲಾತಿ ಮಾಡಿರ್ತಕ್ಕಂಥ ರಾಜ್ಯ.
ಬಡ್ತಿ ಮೀಸಲಾತಿಗೆ ಕೇಂದ್ರದಲ್ಲಿ ಕಾನೂನಲ್ಲಿ ಬದಲಾವಣೆ ಮಾಡಿದ್ದ ವಾಜಪೇಯಿ ಸರ್ಕಾರ ಇದ್ದಾಗ. ಅದನ್ನು ಹೇಳ್ರಿ ಪೂರ್ತಿ.
ಸುಪ್ರೀಂ ಕೋರ್ಟ್ ನಲ್ಲಿ ಹೊಡೆದಾಕ್ಬಿಡ್ತು, ಗೊತ್ತಾಯ್ತಾ?
ಅದನ್ನು ಪೂರ್ತಿ
ಎಲ್ಲ ಸುಪ್ರೀಂ ಕೋರ್ಟ್ ನಲ್ಲಿ ಹೊಡೆದಾಕಿರೋದು
ಮಾಡಿದ್ವಲ್ಲ, ಕಾನೂನು ಮಾಡಿದ್ ನಾವಲ್ಲ.
ಆಯ್ತಪ್ಪ, ಸುಪ್ರೀಂ ಕೋರ್ಟ್ ನಲ್ಲಿ ಹೊಡೆದಾಕಿರೋದು ಗೊತ್ತಾಯ್ತಾ?
ಆಗ್ಲಿ, ಕಾನೂನು ಮಾಡಿದ್ ನಾವಲ್ಲ.
ನಾವು ಮಾಡಿದ್ವಲ್ಲ, ನೀವ್ಯಾಕೆ ಮಾಡ್ಲಿಲ್ಲ?
ನಾವು ಮಾಡಿದ್ದು.
ನೀವೆಲ್ಲ ಮಾಡಿದಿರಿ.
ಕಾನೂನದಲ್ಲಿ ಸಂವಿಧಾನದಲ್ಲಿ
ನೀವು ಮಾಡಿಲ್ಲ
ಆಗಲಿ ಅಂತೇಳಿ ಸಂವಿಧಾನದಲ್ಲಿ ಬದಲಾವಣೆ ಮಾಡಿದ್ ನಾವು. ಎಮರ್ಜೆನ್ಸಿ ಸಂಬಂಧ ಸಂವಿಧಾನ ಬದಲಾವಣೆ ಮಾಡಲಿಲ್ಲ ನಾವು. ಸುಪ್ರೀಂ ಕೋರ್ಟ್ ನಾವು ದಲಿತರಿಗೆ ಅನುಕೂಲ ಆಗಲಿ ಅಂತ ವಾಜಪೇಯಿ ಕಾನೂನದಲ್ಲಿ ಬದಲಾವಣೆ ಮಾಡಿದ್ರು.
ಈಗ ಮಧ್ಯೆ ಹೇಳ್ಬೇಡ್ರಿ, ಸಂಪ್ರದಾಯ ಅಲ್ಲ. ಸ್ವಲ್ಪ ಅವಾಗ ಕುರ್ತಾಕೇನ್ ಕೇಳಪ್ಪ, ಕ್ಲಾರಿಫಿಕೇಶನ್ ತಿಳ್ಕೊಂಡಿದ್ರಿ ನನಗೆ ಗೊತ್ತಾಗ್ತಾ ಇಲ್ಲ.
ನೀನು
ಅಲ್ಲಿ ಕೂತ್ಕೊಂಡು ನಾವು ಆಗಿ ಈಗೆಲ್ಲ ಎದಾಳದಿಲ್ಲ. ನಾನು ಬೇರೆ ಪಾಯಿಂಟ್ ಬೈ ಪಾಯಿಂಟ್ ಎದಳ್ತೀನಿ. ನಾನು
ಏನೇ ಪ್ರಯತ್ನ ಮಾಡಿದ್ರು ಕೂಡ ನನ್ನ ದಾರಿ ತಪ್ಪಲ್ಲ. ಮಾನ್ಯ ಅಧ್ಯಕ್ಷರೇ, ಬಡ್ತಿ ಮೀಸಲಾತಿಯನ್ನು ಸುಪ್ರೀಂ ಕೋರ್ಟ್ನಲ್ಲಿ ಬಡ್ತಿ ಮೀಸಲಾತಿ ಹೊಡೆದಾಕ್ಬಿಟ್ರು.
ಹೌದು, ಸುಪ್ರೀಂ ಕೋರ್ಟ್ ಅಲ್ಲಿ ಹೋಯ್ತು ಅದು ಕೇಸ್.
ಹೋಯ್ತು. ಅದು ಹೋದ್ಮೇಲೆ ರತ್ನಪ್ರಭಾ ಅಂತ ಚೀಫ್ ಸೆಕ್ರೆಟರಿ ಇದ್ರು. ಆಗ ಚೀಫ್ ಸೆಕ್ರೆಟರಿ ಆಗಿದ್ದವರು ರತ್ನಪ್ರಭಾ ಅಧ್ಯಕ್ಷತೆಯಲ್ಲಿ ಒಂದು ಸಮಿತಿ ಮಾಡಿ ಅವರಿಂದ ವರದಿ ತರಿಸ್ಕೊಂಡು ಇಡೀ ದೇಶದಲ್ಲಿ ಸುಪ್ರೀಂ ಕೋರ್ಟ್ ಹೊಡೆದಾಕಿದ್ರು ಕೂಡ ನಾವು ನ್ಯಾಯಾಲಯಗಳ ಆದೇಶ ಮೀರಿ ಮೀಸಲಾತಿ ಮತ್ತೆ ಬಡ್ತಿ ಮೀಸಲಾತಿಯನ್ನು ಕೊಟ್ಟರು. ಇದು ಇಟ್ ಈಸ್ ಚಾಲೆಂಜ್ ಬಿಫೋರ್ ದಿ ಸುಪ್ರೀಂ ಕೋರ್ಟ್. ದಿ ಸುಪ್ರೀಂ ಕೋರ್ಟ್ upheld our decision. ಬೇರೆ ರಾಜ್ಯಗಳಲ್ಲಿ ಯಾಕೆ ಮಾಡಿಲ್ಲ? ಬಹಳ ದಲಿತರ ಬಗ್ಗೆ ಕಾಳಜಿ ಇರೋರು ಬೇರೆ ರಾಜ್ಯದಲ್ಲಿ ಯಾಕೆ ಮಾಡಿಲ್ಲ? ಕರ್ನಾಟಕ ಇಸ್ ದಿ ಓನ್ಲಿ ಸ್ಟೇಟ್ ಬಡ್ತಿ ಮೀಸಲಾತಿಗೆ ಅದಕ್ಕೆ ಕಾನೂನು ಮಾಡಿ ಅದು ಸುಪ್ರೀಂ ಕೋರ್ಟ್ನ ನಲ್ಲಿ ಅಪೇಲ್ಡ್ ಆಗಿದೆ. ದಟ್ ಈಸ್ ಎರಡನೇದು. ಮೂರನೇದು ಗುತ್ತಿಗೆನಲ್ಲಿ ಮೀಸಲಾತಿ ನೀವ್ಯಾಕೆ ಮಾಡಲಿಲ್ಲ? ಈಗ 1% ಇದನ್ನು 2% ಮಾಡಿದ್ದೀವಿ.
2 ಕೋಟಿ
2 ಕೋಟಿ ಮಾಡಿ, ಸಾರಿ 1 ಕೋಟಿ ಇದ್ದದನ್ನ 2 ಕೋಟಿ ಮಾಡಿದ್ದೀವಿ. ಆಮೇಲೆ 7D ರದ್ದು ಮಾಡಿದ್ದೀವಿ. PTCL ಕಾಯ್ದೆ ನೀವ್ಯಾಕೆ ಮಾಡಲಿಲ್ಲ? PTCL ಕಾಯ್ದೆನಲ್ಲಿ ಸುಪ್ರೀಂ ಕೋರ್ಟ್ ನೀಡಿದ ತೀರ್ಪನ್ನು ಆಧರಿಸಿ ನೆಕ್ಕಂಟಿ ರಾಮಲಕ್ಷ್ಮಿ ಪ್ರಕರಣದಲ್ಲಿ ಸುಪ್ರೀಂ ಕೋರ್ಟ್ನವರು ಒಂದು ಡಿಸಿಷನ್ ಕೊಡ್ತಾರೆ. ಅದನ್ನು ಆಧರಿಸಿ ಅನೇಕ ನ್ಯಾಯಾಲಯಗಳಲ್ಲಿ ದಲಿತರಿಗೆ ಅನ್ಯಾಯ ಆಗ್ಬಿಡ್ತದೆ. ಅದನ್ನು ನಾವು ಅಮೆಂಡ್ಮೆಂಟ್ ಮಾಡಿ, ನಾವು ಅಧಿಕಾರಕ್ಕೆ ಬಂದ ಮೇಲೆ ಅಮೆಂಡ್ಮೆಂಟ್ ಮಾಡಿ PTCL ಕಾಯ್ದೆಗೆ ತಿದ್ದುಪಡಿ ತಗೊಬಂದು ಅವರಿಗೆ ರಕ್ಷಣೆ ಕೊಡ್ತಕ್ಕಂಥ ಕೆಲಸವನ್ನು ಮಾಡಿದ್ದೀವಿ. ಇವ್ರು ಯಾಕೆ ಮಾಡಲಿಲ್ಲ? 4 ವರ್ಷ ಅಧಿಕಾರದಲ್ಲಿ ಇದರಲ್ಲಿ ಯಾಕೆ ಮಾಡಲಿಲ್ಲ? ದಲಿತರ ಬಗ್ಗೆ ಕಾಳಜಿ ವ್ಯಕ್ತ ಮಾಡೋರು ಯಾಕೆ ಮಾಡಲಿಲ್ಲ? ಇದನ್ನು ಮಾಡಬೇಕಾಗ್ತದೆ. ಅದರಿಂದ ನಾನು ಇನ್ನು ಉಳಿದ ವಿಚಾರಗಳ ಬಗ್ಗೆ ಮಧ್ಯಪ್ರದೇಶದಲ್ಲಿ ಏನಾಯಿತು, ಮಹಾರಾಷ್ಟ್ರದಲ್ಲಿ ಏನಾಯಿತು, ಮೋದಿಯವರ ಸರ್ಕಾರದಲ್ಲಿ ಏನಾಯಿತು, ಇದರ ಬಗ್ಗೆ ಎಲ್ಲ ನಾನು ಬಜೆಟ್ ಮೇಲೆ ಉತ್ತರ ಕೊಡುವಾಗ ಕೊಡ್ತೀನಿ ಮಾನ್ಯ ಅಧ್ಯಕ್ಷರೇ. ಆಮೇಲೆ ಮಾನ್ಯ ವಿರೋಧ ಪಕ್ಷದ ನಾಯಕರು ಸಿದ್ದರಾಮಯ್ಯನವರು ಹಿಂದುಳಿದ ಜಾತಿಗೆ ಸೇರಿದವರು, ಹಿಂದುಳಿದವರಿಗೆ ಏನೂ ಮಾಡಲಿಲ್ಲ ಅಂತ ಹೇಳ್ತಾರೆ. ಹಿಂದುಳಿದ ಜಾತಿಗೆ ಸೇರಿದವರು ಅಹಿಂದ ಸಂಘಟನೆ ಮಾಡ್ತಿದ್ದೀವಿ ಅಂತ ಹೇಳ್ತಿದ್ರು, ಏನು ಮಾಡಲಿಲ್ಲ ಅಂತ ಹೇಳ್ತಾರೆ. ನಾವು ಸೃಷ್ಟಿಯಲ್ಲ, ನೀವು ಹೇಳ್ತಾ ಇದ್ದೀನಪ್ಪ.
ಇದುವರೆಗೂ ಏನ್ ಮಾತಾಡಿದ್ರು ಅದು ಯಾವುದು ನಾನು ಮಾತಾಡೇ ಇಲ್ಲ.
ಬಜೆಟ್ ಅಲ್ಲಿ ಮಾತಾಡಿರಿ,
ಜಾಸ್ತಿ ಮಾತಾಡೋದು
ವಿರೋಧ ಪಕ್ಷದ ನಾಯಕರೇ. ನೀವು SCP TSP ಹೈಲೈಟ್ ಮಾಡಿದ್ದು ಬಜೆಟ್ ಭಾಷಣದಲ್ಲಿ, ರಾಜ್ಯಪಾಲರು ಇದಲ್ಲಿ ಮಾಡಲಿಲ್ಲ. ಆದ್ರೆ ನೀವು ಮಾತಾಡಿದ್ದೀರಾ, ಈಗ ಮಾತಾಡಿಲ್ಲ.
ನಾನು ಬಜೆಟ್ ಅಲ್ಲಿ ಮಾತಾಡಿದೆ, ಇವರು ಆಮೇಲೆ ಮಾತಾಡ್ತೀನಿ ನಾನು. ಇವ್ರು ಬೇರೆ ಮಾತಾಡ್ತಾರೆ, ನಾನು ಮಾತಾಡೇ ಇಲ್ಲ. ಯಾವ ಹಿಂದುಳಿದು ಮಾತಾಡಿಲ್ಲ.
ಮಾತಾಡಿಲ್ವಾ?
ಮಾತಾಡಿರಿ.
ಬೇಡ, ಹಾಗಾದ್ರೆ ಉತ್ತರ ಕೊಡೋದಿಲ್ಲ. ಬಜೆಟ್ ಮೇಲೆ ಉತ್ತರ ಕೊಡುವಾಗ ಕೊಡ್ತೀನಿ. ಕಾನೂನು ಸುವ್ಯವಸ್ಥೆ ಬಗ್ಗೆ ಮಾತಾಡಿಲ್ವಾ?
ಮಾತಾಡಿದ್ದಾರೆ. ಹೌದು, ನನಗೆ ಗೊತ್ತಿದೆಯಲ್ಲ.
ಎಲ್ಲ ಅಧ್ಯಕ್ಷರೇ ಹೇಳ್ಬಿಟ್ರೆ ಹೆಂಗೆ?
ನಾವಲ್ಲಿ ಕೂತ್ಕೊಂಡು ಕೇಳ್ಕೊಂಡಲ್ವೇನ್ರಿ, ಸುಳ್ಳು ಹೇಳಕ್ಕಾಗತ್ತ? ಮಾತಾಡಿದ್ದಾರೆ ಎಂದೆ.
ಕಾನೂನಿನ ಸುವ್ಯವಸ್ಥೆ ಬಗ್ಗೆ ಅಧ್ಯಕ್ಷರು ಮಾತಾಡಿದ್ದಾರೆ. ಕಾನೂನು ಸುವ್ಯವಸ್ಥೆ ಹಾಳಾಗಿದೆ. ವಸ್ತುಸ್ಥಿತಿ ಏನಪ್ಪಾ ಅಂತಂದ್ರೆ 2022ರಲ್ಲಿ ನೀವಿದ್ದರೆ ಇತ್ತಲ್ಲ ಅಪರಾಧಗಳಾದವಲ್ಲ ಅದಕ್ಕಿಂತ ಕಡಿಮೆ ಆಗಿದ್ದಾವೆ. ನಿಮಗೆ ಅಂಕಿಅಂಶಗಳು ಕೊಡಬೇಕು ಅಂತಂದ್ರೆ 2022ರಲ್ಲಿ ಕೊಲೆ ಪ್ರಕರಣಗಳು 13,365. ನಮ್ಮ ಕಾಲದಲ್ಲಿ 2024ರಲ್ಲಿ 1,209 ಕಡಿಮೆ ಆಯಿತು. 156 ಕಡಿಮೆ ಆದವು. ಕೊಲೆ ಯತ್ನ ಅಟೆಂಪ್ಟ್ ಟು ಮರ್ಡರ್ 2,828 2022 ನಿಮ್ಮ ಕಾಲದಲ್ಲಿ. ನಮ್ಮ ಕಾಲದಲ್ಲಿ 2,809 19 ಕಡಿಮೆ ಆದವು. ಡಕಾಯಿತಿ 215 ನಮ್ಮ ಕಾಲದಲ್ಲಿ 154 ಸುಮಾರು 61 ಕಡಿಮೆ ಆದವು. ರಾಬರಿ 1066 ನಮ್ಮ ಕಾಲದಲ್ಲಿ 992 74 ಕಡಿಮೆ ಆಯಿತು. ದೊಂಬಿ 3,930 3,450 480 ಕಡಿಮೆ ಆಯಿತು. ಸರಗಳ್ಳತನ ಚೈನ್ ಸ್ನ್ಯಾಚಿಂಗ್ 669 617 ನಮ್ಮ ಕಾಲದಲ್ಲಿ ಸುಮಾರು 52 ಕಡಿಮೆ ಆಯಿತು. ಡ್ರಗ್ಸ್ 6,406 ನಿಮ್ಮ
ಸರ್. ಅದು ವಾಲ್ಮೀಕಿ ಹಗರಣ ಡಕಾಯಿತಿಯಲ್ಲಿ ಬರುತ್ತೆ, ಎದರಲ್ಲಿ ಬರುತ್ತೆ ಸರ್? ವಾಲ್ಮೀಕಿ ಹಗರಣ ಡಕಾಯಿತಿಯಲ್ಲಿ ಬರುತ್ತೆ, ಎಲ್ಲಿ ಬರುತ್ತೆ?
ಐ ಡೋಂಟ್ ಆನ್ಸರ್.
ಇವರೇ ಎಲ್ಲದವ್ರೆ
ಪದೇ ಪದೇ ಎದ್ದೇಳ್ಬೇಡಿ.
ಒಬ್ರು ಉಪನಾಯಕರು ಪದೇ ಪದೇ ಎದ್ದೇಳ್ಬಾರ್ದ್ರಿ, ಆಮೇಲೆ ಕೇಳ್ರಿ.
ನಿಮ್ಗೆ ಏನು ದೊಡ್ಡ
ನಿಮಿಷ ಜಾಸ್ತಿ ತಗೊಂಡು ಕೇಳ್ರಿ.
ನಿಮ್ ದೊಡ್ಡ ಪಾರ್ಲಿಮೆಂಟ್ ಇರೋನ್ ಅಂದ್ಬಿಡ್ತಾರ ನಿಮಗೆ? ಕೂತ್ಕೊಳ್ರಿ.
ಸಂಧಿ ಎದಾಳ್ಬಾರ್ದ್ರಿ. ಒಬ್ಬ ಉಪನಾಯಕರ ಘನತೆ ಗೌರವ ಹಂಗ ಎದಾಳ್ಬಾರ್ದು ಸಂಧಿ.
ಯು ಆರ್ ದಿ ಡೆಪ್ಟಿ ಲೀಡರ್. ಅರ್ಥ ಮಾಡ್ಕೋಬೇಕು. ನಾನು ಈಲ್ಡಾಗದೆ ಕೇಳಬಾರ್ದು ಅಂತ ಅಷ್ಟು ಗೊತ್ತಿಲ್ಲ ನಿಮ್ಗೆ? ಡ್ರಗ್ ಸಂಬಂಧಿತ ಕೇಸ್ಗಳು 6,406 ನಮ್ಮ ಕಾಲದಲ್ಲಿ 4,188 2,218 ಕಡಿಮೆ ಆಗಿದ್ದಾವೆ. SC/ST ದೌರ್ಜನ್ಯ ಪ್ರಬಂಧಕ ಕಾಯ್ದೆ ನಿಮ್ಮ ಕಾಲದಲ್ಲಿ 2,138 ನಮ್ಮ ಕಾಲದಲ್ಲಿ 2,113 25 ಕಡಿಮೆ ಆಗಿದ್ದಾವೆ. ಇವೆಲ್ಲವೂ ಕೂಡ ಪ್ರಮುಖವಾದಂಥ ಅಪರಾಧಗಳಿದಾವಲ್ಲ ಅವರಲ್ಲೆಲ್ಲ ಕಡಿಮೆ ಆಗಿದ್ದಾವೆ ನಮ್ಮ ಕಾಲದಲ್ಲಿ. ಕಾನೂನು ಸುವ್ಯವಸ್ಥೆ ಹಾಳಾಗ್ಬಿಟ್ಟಿದೆ. ನಿಮ್ಮ ಕಾಲದಲ್ಲಿ ಹಾಳಾಗಿತ್ತು, ನಮ್ಮ ಕಾಲದಲ್ಲಿ ಹಾಳಾಗಿತ್ತು. ಇದನ್ನೇ ರಾಷ್ಟ್ರಪತಿಗಳು ಇವರು ರಾಜ್ಯಪಾಲರು ಭಾಷಣದಲ್ಲಿ ಹೇಳಿರ್ತಕ್ಕಂಥದ್ದು.
ಎಲ್ಲರೂ ಬರ್ಕೊಟ್ಟೆ ಅಲ್ವ ನೀವು ಓದಿಸೋದು?
ಆಯ್ತು, ಮುಂದೆ ಓದಿದ್ದಾರಲ್ಲ
ನೀವು. ಇನ್ನೇನು ಬೇರೆದವ್ರು ಬರ್ಕೊಟ್ಟಿದ್ರ? ನೀವು ಅದೇ ಪೆನ್ನಲ್ಲಿ ಬರ್ಕೊಟ್ಟದ್ದು.
ನೀವ್ಯಾಕೆ ಬರ್ಕೊಟ್ಟಿದ್ರು ರಾಜ್ಯಪಾಲರಿಗೆ?
ಅಧ್ಯಕ್ಷರು ವರ್ಷ ಚೇಂಜ್ ಆಗ್ಬಿಟ್ಟಿದೆ.
ವಿರೋಧ ಪಕ್ಷ ಕೂತ್ಕೊಂಡ ತಕ್ಷಣ ನಿಮ್ಮ ವರ್ಷನ್ ಚೇಂಜ್ ಆಗ್ಬಿಡ್ತದ? ದಟ್ ಈಸ್ ಕಾನ್ಸ್ಟಿಟ್ಯೂಷನ್. ಅದನ್ನೇ ಹೇಳೋದು. ನೀವು ಇದ್ದಾಗ ಅಧಿಕಾರದಲ್ಲಿ ಇದ್ದಾಗಲೇ ನೀವೇ ಬರ್ಕೊಟ್ಟಿದ್ದವು, ನಾವು ಅಧಿಕಾರದಲ್ಲಿದ್ದಾಗ ನಾವೇ ಬರ್ಕೊಡೋದು. ಆದರೆ ರಾಜ್ಯಪಾಲರ ವಿವೇಚನೆ ಇರ್ತದೆ. ಅವ್ರು ಸುಮ್ಮನೆ ಓದೋದಿಲ್ಲ. ನಾವು ಬರ್ಕೊಟ್ಟದನ್ನೆಲ್ಲ ಓದೋದಿಲ್ಲ, ಓದ್ಬೇಕಂತಲೂ ಇಲ್ಲ.
ಕಳೆದ ಸರ್ಕಾರಕ್ಕಿಂತ ಹೆಚ್ಚು ಕಮಿಷನ್ ತಗೊಂಡಿದ್ದೀವಿ ಅನ್ನೋದನ್ನ ಹೇಳಿದ್ದಾರೆ. ಅದನ್ನ ಹೇಳಿ. ಹೌದು, ಕಾಂಟ್ರಾಕ್ಟ್ ಸಂಘದವರು ಒಂದು ಪತ್ರ ಬರೆದಿದ್ದಾರೆ ನಿಮಗೆ. ಅದ್ರಲ್ಲಿ ಅವರು ಹೇಳ್ತಾರೆ ಕಳೆದ ಸರ್ಕಾರಕ್ಕಿಂತ ಹೆಚ್ಚು ಕಮಿಷನ್ ಅನ್ನು ನಿಮ್ಮ ಇಲಾಖೆ ಅಧಿಕಾರಿಗಳು ತೆಗೆದುಕೊಳ್ತಾ ಇದ್ದಾರೆ ಅಂತ. ಅದು ಹೋಲಿಕೆ ಮಾಡಿ. ಇದನ್ನ ಯಾಕೆ ಹೋಲಿಕೆ ಮಾಡ್ತೀರಿ?
ಇದನ್ನ ಹೇಳಿದ್ರೆ ನಿಮಗೆ ತಡ್ಕೊಳಕ್ಕಾಗಲ್ಲ, ಏನ್ ಮಾಡೋದು?
ಅಲ್ಲ ಸರ್,
ಸತ್ಯ ಹೇಳಿದ್ರೆ ತಡ್ಕೊಳಕ್ಕಾಗಲ್ಲ.
ವ್ಯಕ್ತಿತ್ವಕ್ಕೆ ಸೂಟ್ ಅಲ್ಲ ಸರ್. ಇದನ್ನ ಹಿಂಗೆ ಹೋಲಿಕೆ ಮಾಡಬಾರ್ದು ಸರ್. ಇದಕ್ಕೆ ಹೋಲಿಕೆ ಮಾಡಬಾರ್ದು ಸರ್.
ಇದಕ್ಕೆ ಇನ್ಯಾವ್ದಕ್ಕೆ ಹೋಲಿಕೆ ಮಾಡ್ತೀರಿ?
ಹೆಂಗ್ ಸರ್ ಇದು ಅಪರಾಧಗಳನ್ನು ಹೋಲಿಕೆ ಒಂದ್ ಸರ್ಕಾರ ಮಾಡಿದ್ರೆ ನಿಮ್ಮ ಘನತೆಗೆ ತಕ್ಕದಲ್ಲ ಸರ್.
ನಾವೇ ಸದನದಲ್ಲಿ ನೋಡ್ತೀವಿ, ನಿಮ್ ಮಂಗಳೂರಿನವ್ರದೇ ಜಾಸ್ತಿ ಕರ್ರಿ. ಎದ್ದು ಬಿಡ್ತೀರಾ ಏನ್ ಇದೇ ಇಲ್ದಂಗೆ ಎದ್ದು ಬಿಡ್ತೀರಾ ಸುಮ್ನೆ. ಓ ಎಲ್ಲ ಹರಿಶ್ಚಂದ್ರ ಮೊಮ್ಮಕ್ಳ ಏನ್ ಮಾಡಕ್ಕಾಗತ್ತೆ? ಈಗ ಅಧ್ಯಕ್ಷರು ಇಲ್ಲಿದ್ದಾರೆ, ನೀವು ಅಲ್ಲಿ ಕೂತಿದ್ದೀರಲ್ಲ, ಏನ್ ಮಾಡ್ತೀರಿ? ನಮ್ಮ ಪುಣ್ಯಕ್ಕೆಲ್ಲ ನೀವು ಅಲ್ಲೇ ಗೆದ್ದು ಬಂದಿದ್ದೀರಾ ಬಿಜೆಪಿ.
ಅದರಿಂದ
ಆ ಪೀಠದಲ್ಲಿ ಮಾತಾಡುವ
ಅಧ್ಯಕ್ಷರೇ,
ಮಂಗಳೂರಿನ ಬಗ್ಗೆ ಹೀಗೆ ಮಾತಾಡಬಾರ್ದು ನೀವು.
ಮಂಗಳೂರಿನ ಪ್ರೀತಿ
ಮಂಗಳೂರಿನವರೆಲ್ಲರೂ ಸತ್ಯ ಹರಿಶ್ಚಂದ್ರ ಅಂತ ಆ ರೀತಿ ಮಾತಾಡಬಾರ್ದು.
ಅಲ್ಲ, ಹರಿಶ್ಚಂದ್ರ ಅಂತ ಅಧ್ಯಕ್ಷರೆಲ್ಲ ಹೇಳಿದ್ದು, ಮಂಗಳೂರಿನವರು ಹಂಗ್ ಮಾತಾಡ್ತೀರಿ ಅಂತ. ನೀವು ಕೂಗಿ ಅಭ್ಯಾಸ ಐತಲ್ರಿ.
ಆಯ್ತು, ಮಂಗಳೂರು ಮಾತಾಡ್ಲಿ, ಉತ್ತರ ಕೊಡೋಣ. ಅವರು ಮಾತಾಡದಷ್ಟು ಪಾಪ ಮಾತಾಡಬೇಕು. ಇಲ್ಲಿ ಅಸೆಂಬ್ಲಿನಲ್ಲಿ ಮಾತಾಡಕ್ಕೆ ಇರೋದು, ಇದು ಮಾತಾಡಕ್ಕೆ ಇಲ್ಲ, ಉತ್ತರ ಕೊಡೋಣ.
ಮುಖ್ಯಮಂತ್ರಿಗಳಿಗೆ ಟೈಮಿನ ಇದು ನಾವು ಫಿಕ್ಸ್ ಮಾಡಂಗಿಲ್ಲ. ಅಧ್ಯಕ್ಷರು, ಸಭಾನಾಯಕರು ಅವ್ರು ಎಷ್ಟು ತೀರ್ಮಾನ ತಗೋತಾರೆ ಅಷ್ಟನ್ನು ನಾವು ಅಧ್ಯಕ್ಷರ ಕೆಲಸ ಮಾಡ್ಬೇಕಷ್ಟೇ, ಅಧ್ಯಕ್ಷರ ಡ್ಯೂಟಿ. ಬಟ್ ಮುಖ್ಯಮಂತ್ರಿಗಳಿಗೆ ಟೈಮ್ ಫಿಕ್ಸ್ ಮಾಡಂಗಿಲ್ಲ. ಅದರಿಂದ ವಿರೋಧ ಪಕ್ಷದ ನಾಯಕರಿಗೆ ಒಂದ್ ವೇಳೆ ರಿಕ್ವೆಸ್ಟ್ ಮಾಡಿದ್ರು ಮಾಡಬಹುದು, ಸಭಾ ನಾಯಕರಿಗೆ ಮಾಡಂಗಿಲ್ಲ.
ಈ
ಸದ್ಯದಲ್ಲೇ ಕ್ಯಾಬಿನೆಟ್ ಎಕ್ಸ್ಪೆನ್ಷನ್ ಇದೆ.
ಕೆಲಸ ಏನು?
ಸದ್ಯದಲ್ಲೇ ಕ್ಯಾಬಿನೆಟ್ ಎಕ್ಸ್ಪೆನ್ಷನ್ ಇದೆ. ಶಿವಲಿಂಗೇಗೌಡರೆ ಫಿಕ್ಸ್.
ಸಮಾಜದಲ್ಲಿ ಶಾಂತಿಯನ್ನ ಕಾಪಾಡ್ತಕ್ಕಂಥದ್ದು, ಅಪರಾಧಗಳನ್ನ ಕಡಿಮೆ ಮಾಡ್ತಕ್ಕಂಥದ್ದು, ಆಮೇಲೆ ಯಾರು ಅಪರಾಧ ಮಾಡಿರ್ತಾರೆ ಅವರಿಗೆ ಶಿಕ್ಷೆ ಕೊಡಿಸ್ತಕ್ಕಂಥದ್ದು. ಈ ಕೆಲಸ ಹೋಮ್ ಡಿಪಾರ್ಟ್ಮೆಂಟ್ನವರು ಮಾಡ್ತಕ್ಕಂಥದ್ದು. ಅದನ್ನ ಬಹಳ ಪರಿಣಾಮಕಾರಿಯಾಗಿ ನಾವು ಮಾಡಿದ್ದೀವಿ. ಸೊ ಅನೇಕ ಪ್ರಕರಣಗಳಲ್ಲಿ ಸೀರಿಯಸ್ ಅಫೆನ್ಸಸ್ಗಳು ನಡೆದಂತ ಕಡೆ ಅಪರಾಧಿಗಳನ್ನ ಪತ್ತೆ ಹಚ್ಚಿದ್ದೀವಿ. ನಿನ್ನೆ ತಾನೇ ಡ್ರಗ್ಸ್ ಮಂಗಳೂರಿನಲ್ಲಿ 75 ಕೆಜಿ ಅಲ್ಲ 75 ಕೋಟಿ ಡ್ರಗ್ಸ್ ಅನ್ನ ಸೀಜ್ ಮಾಡಿದ್ದೀವಿ. ನೀವೇ ತಾನೇ ಅಭಿನಂದನೆಗಳನ್ನು ಹೇಳಿದಿರಿ ನಮ್ಮ ಪೊಲೀಸ್ನವ್ರಿಗೆ. ನೀವೇ ಹೇಳಿದಿರಿ, ಪೊಲೀಸ್ಗೆ ಅಭಿನಂದನೆಗಳನ್ನ ಹೇಳಿದಿರಿ. ಸೊ ಅದರಿಂದ ನಾವು ಅಧಿಕಾರಕ್ಕೆ ಬಂದ ಮೇಲೆ ಎಷ್ಟು ಕಡಿಮೆ ಮಾಡಲಿಕ್ಕೆ ಸಾಧ್ಯ ಆಗ್ತದೆ ಹಾಗಂತ ಹೇಳಿ ನನಗೆ ತೃಪ್ತಿಯಾಗಿದೆ ಅಂತ ಅಲ್ಲ. ನಾವು ಇನ್ನೂ ಕಡಿಮೆ ಮಾಡ್ತಕ್ಕಂಥ ಅಪರಾಧಗಳೇ ನಡಿಬಾರ್ದಾಗಿರ್ತಕ್ಕಂಥ, ಆದರೆ ಅಪರಾಧಗಳನ್ನ ಮಾಡ್ತಕ್ಕಂಥವ್ರೆ ನೀವು ಜಾಸ್ತಿಯಾಗಿ. RSSನವರು ದೇಶದ ರಾಜಕಾರಣ ಮಾಡವ್ರೆ ಇವರು. ನೀನು RSS ಎಲ್ಲ ಕೂತ್ಕೊಳ್ಳಪ್ಪ. ಅಶೋಕ ಕಬಡ್ಡಿ ಆಡ್ತೀನಿ, ನೀನೆಲ್ಲಿ RSS ಹೋಗಿದ್ದೆ? ನೀ RSS ಯಾಕಕ್ಕೆ ಹೋಗೇ ಇಲ್ಲ.
ಈಗ
ಈ ಇಚಿಂಗ್ ಹಾಗೂ ಡ್ಯಾಂಡ್ರಫ್ ಇದೆಯಲ್ಲ, ಯಾವಾಗ್ಲೂ ಬೇಡದ ಸಮಯದಲ್ಲೇ ಬರುತ್ತದೆ. ಅದಕ್ಕಾಗಿಯೇ ಹಿಮಾಲಯ ಆಂಟಿ ಡ್ಯಾಂಡ್ರಫ್ ಟೀ ಟ್ರೀ ಶಾಂಪೂ. ಟೀ ಟ್ರೀ ಡ್ಯಾಂಡ್ರಫ್ ನಿವಾರಿಸಲು ಸಹಾಯ ಮಾಡುತ್ತದೆ. ಆಲೋವೆರಾ ಇಚಿಂಗ್ ನಿಂದ ಆರಾಮ ನೀಡುತ್ತದೆ. ಹಿಮಾಲಯ ಆಂಟಿ ಡ್ಯಾಂಡ್ರಫ್ ಟೀ ಟ್ರೀ ಶಾಂಪೂ. ಡ್ಯಾಂಡ್ರಫ್ ಮತ್ತು ಇಚ್ ಫ್ರೀ ಮುಕ್ತ ಕೂದಲನ್ನು 100% ವರೆಗೆ ಪಡೆಯಿರಿ.
ನಿಮ್ಗೆಲ್ರಿಗೂ ಇತ್ಕೊಂಡು ಗಲಾಟೆ ಮಾಡಿ ಅಂತ ಹೇಳ್ಕೊಟ್ರೆ ಗೊತ್ತು
ಎಲ್ಲ ಕೂಗಾಡಿದ್ರೆ ಯಾರು ಕೇಳ್ತಿಲ್ಲ, ಯಾರು ಕೇಳಲ್ಲ.
ಸಭಾಧ್ಯಕ್ಷರೇ, ಈ ದೇಶದ್ರೋಹ ಭಯೋತ್ಪಾದಕರಿಗೆ ಸಪೋರ್ಟ್ ಆಗ್ತಕ್ಕಂಥ SDP PFI ಅವರ ಕೇಸ್ ವಿಡ್ರಾ ಮಾಡಿದವರೇ ಇವರು. ಕೇಸ್ ವಿಡ್ರಾ ಮಾಡಿದವರು
ಯಾವ ಕೇಸನ್ನು ವಿಡ್ರಾ ಮಾಡಿಲ್ಲ, ಯಾವ ಕೇಸನ್ನು ವಿಡ್ರಾ ಮಾಡಿಲ್ಲ. ನೀವು ಬೆಂಬಲ ಕೊಡ್ತಾ ಇರ್ತಕ್ಕಂಥವ್ರು ದೇಶದ ಭಾಷಣ ಮಾಡಿದವರಿಗೆ ನಮ್ಮ ಕಾಂಗ್ರೆಸ್ನಲ್ಲಿ ನೀ RSS ನವನಲ್ಲ, ಕೂತು ನಾಟ್ RSS.
ವಾಪಸ್ ತಗೊಂಡಿದ್ದೀರಿ ನೀವು.
ನಿಮ್ನೆಲ್ಲ ಎತ್ಕಟ್ಟಿದ್ದಾರೆ ನಿಂತ್ಕೊಳ್ಳಿ ಅಂತ
ಹೇಳ್ದೆ. ಮತ್ತೆ ನೋಡು ಸರ್, ನಿಮ್ದೇ ದಲಿತ ಶಾಸಕರ ಮೇಲೆ
ಗೊತ್ತಾಯ್ತು, ನಿಮ್ದೆಲ್ಲ ಗೊತ್ತಾಯ್ತು.
ಆಯ್ತು ಕೂತ್ಕೊಳ್ಳಿ,
ಕೂತ್ಕೊಳ್ರಿ. ಆಯ್ತು, ಕೂತ್ಕೊಳ್ರಿ.
ನೀನ್ ಕೂಗೋದೆಲ್ಲ ಗೊತ್ತಾಗ್ಬಿಡಪ್ಪ, ನೀನ್ RSS ಅಂತ
ಹೌದು. ನಾನು ಉತ್ತರ ಹೇಳೋದೇ ಫೈನಲ್.
ನಾನು ಹೇಳಲ್ಲ, ನೀವು
ಹೌದೌದು. ಮತ್ತೆ ನೀವು ದ್ವೇಷದ ರಾಜಕಾರಣ ಮಾಡ್ತೀರಿ.
ಅಧ್ಯಕ್ಷರೇ,
ಮುಖ್ಯಮಂತ್ರಿ ಮಾತಾಡೋದಾಗ ಅನುಮತಿ ಇಲ್ದಾನೆ ಶಿಕ್ಷಕ ಒಳಬಳ ಮಾತಾಡಿದ್ರೆ
ಮುಖ್ಯಮಂತ್ರಿಗಳು RSS ಅವರೇ ಗಲಭೆ ಮಾಡೋದು ಅಂತ ಹೇಳಿದ್ದಾರೆ. ಅದನ್ನ ಕಡದಿಂದ ತೆಗೆಸಿ, ಇಲ್ಲಾಂದ್ರೆ ನಾವು ಸದನ ನಡೆಯಕ್ಕೆ ಬಿಡಲ್ಲ. 100% ನಾನು RSS. ಇಲ್ಲಿರೋರೆಲ್ಲರೂ ಕೂಡ RSS. ದೇಶದ ಪ್ರಧಾನಿ RSS, ದೇಶದ ಪ್ರಧಾನಿ RSS, ಹೋಮ್ ಮಿನಿಸ್ಟರ್ RSS. ಇವ್ರು ಯಾರೋ ನನ್ನ ಮನೆ ಈ ಬಂದಿರೋರು ಇವರು RSS ಬಗ್ಗೆ ಈ ಮಾತಾಡಿದ್ರೆ ಯಾವುದೇ ಕಾರಣಕ್ಕೂ ಸಹಿಸೋ ಪ್ರಶ್ನೆ. ಈ ಟೆರರಿಸ್ಟ್ ಸಪೋರ್ಟ್ ಮಾಡೋರು ಇವರೆಲ್ಲ. ಕಾಂಗ್ರೆಸ್ ಅವರು ಟೆರರಿಸ್ಟ್ ಸಪೋರ್ಟ್ ಮಾಡೋರು. ಟೆರರಿಸ್ಟ್ ಮನೆ ಸೇರಿಸ್ಕೊಂಡು ನೀವು ರಾಜಕಾರಣ ಮಾಡೋರು. ನೀವು ಮನೆಗೆ ಇಟ್ಕೊಂಡು ರಾಜಕಾರಣ, ಮನೇಲಿ ಇಟ್ಕೊಂಡು ರಾಜಕಾರಣ ಮಾಡೋರು. ನಿಮ್ಮಿಂದ RSS ಕಲಿಬೇಕಾಯ್ತಿಲ್ಲ. RSS ದೇಶವನ್ನ ಕಟ್ಟುವಂತವ್ರು ನೀವು, ದೇಶನ ಹೊಡೆಯೋರು. ಪಾಕಿಸ್ತಾನ ಹೊಡೆಯೋರು ನೀವು, ಬಾಂಗ್ಲಾದೇಶ
ಉತ್ತೇಜನ ಕೊಡುವಂತರು. ನಾವು ದೇಶವನ್ನು ಜೋಡಿಸುವಂತ
ನೋಡಿ, ಕರ್ತವ್ಯದಿಂದ ತೆಗಿಬೇಕು. ನಾನು ಹೇಳ್ತಾ ಇರೋದು
ಕರ್ತವ್ಯದಿಂದ ತೆಗಿಬೇಕು.
ಕಾಂಗ್ರೆಸ್ ಅವರು ಈ PFI ಅದನ್ನು ಹಾಕಿ ಹಂಗಾರೆ ಅದನ್ನು ಬರೀರಿ. ಕಾಂಗ್ರೆಸ್ ಅವರು PFI ಏಜೆಂಟ್ ಅಂತ ಹೇಳ್ತೀರಿ, ಬರೀರಿ ಹಂಗಾರೆ ಅದನ್ನು ಬರೀರಿ ಹಂಗಾರೆ ಅದನ್ನು ಬರ್ಕೊಳ್ಳಿ.
ಮತ್ತೆ PFI ಎಲ್ಲ ಅವ್ರ ಏಜೆಂಟ್ಗಳೆಲ್ಲ
RSS ನವ್ರು ಹೇಳ್ದಾಗ ಮಾಡೋದು,
ನೀವು PFI ಹೇಳ್ದಂಗ್ ಮಾಡೋದು,
RSS ನವ್ರು ಹೇಳ್ದಾಗ
ಮಾಡೋದು.
ಪಾರ್ಟಿ ಅಲ್ಲ,
ಪಾಕಿಸ್ತಾನ ಹೇಳ್ದಂಗ್ ಮಾಡೋರು. ಆಯ್ತು, ನೀವ್ ಹೇಳಿ. PFI ಹೇಳ್ದಂಗ್ ಮಾಡ್ತೀನಿ ಅಂತ ನೀವ್ ಹೇಳಿ.
ಮಾಡೇ ಇಲ್ಲ, PFI ಹೇಳಿದ್ರು ಮಾಡಲ್ಲ, ಯಾರು ಹೇಳಿದ್ರು ನಮ್ಮ ವೈರಿಗಳು.
ಚೈನಾ ಹೇಳೋದು ಮಾಡೋರು, ಪಾಕಿಸ್ತಾನ ಹೇಳೋದು ಮಾಡೋರು. ದೇಶದ್ರೋಹಿ ಚಟುವಟಿಕೆ ನೀವು, ದೇಶ ಉಳಿಯೋರ ಜೊತೆ ಕೈ ಜೋಡಿಸ್ಕೊಂಡು ನೀವು
ಮಹಾತ್ಮ ಗಾಂಧೀಜಿ ಹತ್ಯೆಯಾದಾಗ ನೀವು ಏನಂತ ಮಾಡಿದ್ರು? ಮಹಾತ್ಮ ಗಾಂಧೀಜಿ ಹತ್ಯೆಯಾದಾಗ ವಲ್ಲಭಾಯ್ ಪಟೇಲ್ ಏನಂತ ಮಾಡಿದ್ರು? ನಿಮ್ಮನ್ನ ಬ್ಯಾನ್ ಮಾಡಿದ್ರು.
ಇತಿಹಾಸ ತಿಳ್ಕೊಳ್ಳಿ. ಬ್ಯಾನ್ ಮಾಡಿದ್ರು ನಿಮ್ಗೆ.
ನೋಡಿ ಅಧ್ಯಕ್ಷರೇ, ಯಾವುದೇ ಕಾರಣಕ್ಕೂ RSS ಬಗ್ಗೆ ಮಾತಾಡಿರೋ ಪದನ ವಾಪಸ್ ತೆಗಿಬೇಕು. ಇಲ್ಲ ಅಂದ್ರೆ ಯಾವುದೇ ಕಾರಣಕ್ಕೂ ನಾವು ಬಿಡೋ ಪ್ರಶ್ನೆನೇ ಇಲ್ಲ.
ಮಾಡ್ಲಿ, ನಾವು ಇವ್ರಿಗೆಲ್ಲ ಎದುರ್ಕತ್ತೀವ, ಇವ್ರಿಗೆಲ್ಲ ಎದುರ್ಕತ್ತೀವಿ. ಇವ್ರು ಏನ್ ಮಾಡ್ತಾರೆ ನಾವು ತಯಾರಾಗಿದ್ದೀವಿ ಮಾಡಕ್ಕೆ. ನೀವು ಏನ್ ಮಾಡ್ತೀರಿ ಅದನ್ನ ಎದುರಿಸಕ್ ತಯಾರಾಗಿದ್ದೀವಿ.
ನಾವು ರೆಡಿ ಇದ್ದೀರಿ, ನಾವು ರೆಡಿಯಾಗಿ ಬಂದಿದ್ದೀರಿ.
ಅವ್ರನ್ನ ಎದುರಿಸಲಿಕ್ಕೆ, ಅವರ ಮಾತಾಡ್ತಿರ್ತಕ್ಕಂಥ ಮಾತುಗಳನ್ನ ಎದುರಿಸಲಿಕ್ಕೆ ನಾವು ತಯಾರಾಗಿದ್ದೀವಿ.
ಕಾನೂನು ಕಾಪಾಡಿ, ಕಾನೂನು ಸುರಕ್ಷತೆ ಕಾಪಾಡಿ, ಕಾನೂನು ಪಾಲನೆ ಮಾಡಿ. ಆದ್ರೆ ಈ ರೀತಿ RSS ಸಂಘಟನೆ ಬಗ್ಗೆ
ಕಾನೂನಲ್ಲಿ ನೀವು
ನಿಮ್ಮ ಸ್ಥಾನಕ್ಕೆ ಧಕ್ಕೆ ಬರುತ್ತೆ. ಇಲ್ಲಿ ಕೂತ್ಕೊಂಡು ಅವ್ರ ವಿರುದ್ಧವಾಗಿ ಹೇಳೋದು ಸರಿಯಲ್ಲ.
ನನ್ನ ಅಭಿಪ್ರಾಯ ಅದು.
ನಿಮ್ಮ ಅಭಿಪ್ರಾಯ ಸರಿ, ನೀವು ಹೇಳಿ ಬೇರೆ ಕಡೆ. ಆದ್ರೆ ಇಲ್ಲಿ ಒಂದು ಕಡತದಲ್ಲಿ
ಹೇಳ್ತೀನಿ, ನಾನು ನಿಮ್ಗೆಲ್ಲ ಎದುರ್ಕೊಳ್ಳಲ್ಲ. RSS ನವರಿಗೆಲ್ಲ
ಸರ್ಕಾರ ನಡೆಸೋರು ನೀವು ಈ ರೀತಿ ಮಾತಾಡಿದ್ರೆ
ಬರೇ ಬೆಂಕಿ ಹಚ್ಚದ ಕೆಲಸ,
ಬೆಂಕಿ ಹಚ್ಚ ಕೆಲಸ ನಿಮ್ದು,
ಕಾನೂನು ಕ್ರಮ ತಗೊಳ್ಳಿ,
ಬೆಂಕಿ ಹಚ್ಚ ಕೆಲಸ ನಿಮ್ದು.
ಕ್ರಮ ತಗೊಳ್ಳಿ, ಆಧಾರ
ಅದನ್ನ ತೆಗ್ಸಿ. ಅದನ್ನ
ಇವ್ರ ಮಕ್ಕಳು ಹೋಗ್ತಾರೆ ಕೇಳ್ಬಿಡಿ ಅಧ್ಯಕ್ಷರೇ.
ಇಲ್ಲ, ನಾವು ಪಾಕಿಸ್ತಾನ ಅಂತ ಹೇಳ್ತೀರಿ, ಅವ್ರಿಗೆ ಪಾಕಿಸ್ತಾನದವರು ಅಂತ ಹೇಳ್ತೀರಿ. ಒಪ್ಕೊಂತಾರ ಅವರು, ಪಾಕಿಸ್ತಾನದವರು ಅಂದ್ರೆ ಒಪ್ಕೊಂತಾರ ಅವರು.
ಸಗಣಿ ತಿನ್ನೋದಿಲ್ಲ, ಮಾಡೋದಿಲ್ಲ, ಬರೇ ಬಡವ್ರ ಮಕ್ಕಳಿಗೆ ಎಲ್ಲರೂ, ಬರೇ ಬಡವ್ರ ಮಕ್ಕಳಿಗೆ. ಇವ್ರ ಮಕ್ಕಳು ಎಲ್ಲರೂ ಅಬ್ರಾಡ್ ಹೋಗ್ತಾ ಇದ್ದಾರೆ, ಬಿಸ್ನೆಸ್ ಮಾಡ್ಕೊಂಡಿದ್ದಾರೆ, ಎಜುಕೇಶನ್ ಇನ್ಸ್ಟಿಟ್ಯೂಷನ್ಸ್ ತೆಗ್ದಿದ್ದಾರೆ. ಇವ್ರ ಮಕ್ಕಳು ಯಾರು RSS ಶಾಖೆಗೆ ಹೋಗಲ್ಲ ಅಧ್ಯಕ್ಷರು.
ಎಲ್ಲ ನೀವು ಹೇಳ್ತೀರಾ,
ಕಳಿಸ್ತಾರೆ. ಹೇಳಿ ಯಾರ್ಯಾರ ಮಕ್ಕಳು ಎಲ್ಲೆಲ್ಲಿ ಹೋಗ್ತಾ ಇದ್ದಾರೆ, ಎಷ್ಟು ಜನ RSS ಶಾಖೆ ಕಳಿಸ್ತಾ ಇದ್ದಾರೆ ನಿಮ್ಮ ಮಕ್ಕಳಿಗೆ ತೋರಿಸ್ಬಿಡ್ರಿ. ಎಲ್ಲಿದೆ ತೋರಿಸ್ರಿ. ಯಾರು ಇಲ್ಲ ಅಧ್ಯಕ್ಷರೇ, ಯಾರು ಇಲ್ಲ.
ಮಕ್ಕಳು ಎಲ್ಲೆಲ್ಲಿ ಓಡಾಡ್ತಾರೆ ಅಷ್ಟೇ ಅಂತ ಹೇಳಿ.
ಯಾರು ನಿಮ್ಮ ಮಕ್ಕಳಿಗೆ RSS ಶಾಖೆ ಕಳಿಸ್ತಾ ಇಲ್ಲ. ನಿಮ್ಮ ಇವ್ರ ಮಕ್ಕಳು ಯಾವ ದಲಿತ ಕಾಲೋನಿ ಇದ್ದಾರೆ ಅಂತ ಹೇಳಿ, ಯಾವ ದಲಿತ ಕಾಲೋನಿ ಯಾವ ದಲಿತ ಕಾಲೋನಿಯಲ್ಲಿ ಇವ್ರ ಮಕ್ಕಳಿದ್ದಾರೆ ಅಂತ ಹೇಳಿ ಫಸ್ಟ್. ಆಮೇಲೆ ದಲಿತ ಉದ್ಧಾರ ಮಾಡ್ತೀವಿ ಅಂತ 50 ವರ್ಷ ಹೇಳಿದ್ರಲ್ಲ,
ದಲಿತ ಕಾಲೋನಿಲೇ ಇರಬೇಕು. ಪಾಪ ಮುಖ್ಯವಾಗಿ ಇಲ್ಲಿ ಬರಬಾರ್ದು ಅವರು.
ಎಲ್ಲ
ಸದಾಶಿವನಗರ ಹರಿಕೆಯವರು ದಲಿತ ಕಾಲೋನಿಯಲ್ಲೇ
ಕಳಿಸಲ್ಲ. ನಮ್ಮ ಮಕ್ಕಳು ಸತ್ರು RSS ಶಾಖೆ ಕಳಿಸಲ್ಲ. ನಿಮ್ಮ ಮಕ್ಕಳಿಗೆ ನಿಮ್ಮಂತ ಯೋಗ್ಯತೆ ಇಲ್ಲಿ RSS ಬರೋದೇ ಬೇಡ. ನಿಮ್ಮಂತ ಯೋಗ್ಯತೆ ಬರೋದೇ ಬೇಡ. ಯೋಗ್ಯತೆನೇ ಇಲ್ಲ ಬಿಡಿ, ನಿಮಗೆ ಯೋಗ್ಯತೆ ಇಲ್ಲ, ಯೋಗ್ಯತೆನೇ ಇಲ್ಲ. ನೀವೇ ಆಗ್ಬೇಕ್ರಿ. ಬಾಬಾ ಸಾಹೇಬ್ ಅಂಬೇಡ್ಕರ್ ಯೋಗ್ಯತೆ ಇಲ್ಲ ನಿಮಗೆ. ಗುರುನಾರಾಯಣ್ ತತ್ವವನ್ನು ಕಲಿಸ್ತೀವಿ. ಬಾರಿ ಸದಾಶಿವನಗರದಲ್ಲಿ ಕೂತ್ಕೊಂಡು ದಲಿತರ ಬಗ್ಗೆ ಬಾರಿ ಬರೋದಿಲ್ಲ. ಬರೇ ಸದಾಶಿವನಗರದಲ್ಲಿ ಕೂತ್ಕೊಂಡು ದಲಿತರ ಬಗ್ಗೆ ಮಾತಾಡುತ್ತೀವಿ. ನೀವೇನ್ ಮಾಡಿದ್ದೀರಾ? ನೀವು ನಿಮ್ಮ ಅಪ್ಪ ಮಕ್ಕಳೆಲ್ಲ 50 ವರ್ಷ ಇದನ್ನೇ ಮಾಡಿದ್ದೀರಿ. ನೀವು ದಲಿತರ ಬಗ್ಗೆ ನೀವೇನ್ ಮಾಡಿದ್ದೀರಿ ಹೇಳಿ. ಎಲ್ಲಿದ್ರಪ್ಪ? ಕ್ವಿಟ್ ಇಂಡಿಯಾ
ಗುಲ್ಬರ್ಗ
ಗುಲ್ಬರ್ಗ 75 ವರ್ಷ ಗುಲ್ಬರ್ಗದಲ್ಲಿ ಏನ್ ಮಾಡಿದ್ರಿ ಅಂತ ಗೊತ್ತಿದೆ. ರೌಂಡ್ ಟೇಬಲ್ ಕಾನ್ಫರೆನ್ಸ್ ಇದ್ದಾಗ ಏನ್ ಮಾಡಿದ್ರಿ ಗುಲ್ಬರ್ಗದಲ್ಲಿ? ಎಲ್ಲಿದ್ರಿ? ಯುದ್ಧ ಮಾಡಿದಾಗ ಎಲ್ಲಿದ್ರಿ? ಕೇಳಿ ಅಧ್ಯಕ್ಷರೇ, ಉತ್ತರ ಇಲ್ಲ, ಏನಿಲ್ಲ, ಸುಮ್ಮನೆ ಎದ್ದಿದ್ಕೊಂಡಿಲ್ಲ ಅಷ್ಟೇ. ಗೊತ್ತಿದೆ ನೋಡ್ರಿ, ನಿಮ್ ದೇಶಭಕ್ತಿ ಎಲ್ಲ ಗೊತ್ತಿದೆ. ಅದಕ್ಕೆ ಪಟೇಲ್ ಎಲ್ಲ ಬ್ಯಾನ್ ಮಾಡಿದ್ರು.
ಎದಿಸಿ ಸರ್ ಅದು. ನಾವು ಇಲ್ಲ, ನಾವು
ಪಾರ್ಲಿಮೆಂಟ್ ಉಪಯೋಗಿಸಿಲ್ಲ.
ನಾವು ಒಂದು ಪಾರ್ಲಿಮೆಂಟ್ ನಿಮ್ ಪಾಕಿಸ್ತಾನ ಅಂದ್ಬಿಟ್ರೆ ಬಿಟ್ಬಿಡ್ತೀರಾ ನೀವು?
ಪಾಕಿಸ್ತಾನ ಅಂತ ಯಾಕೆ
ಮತ್ತೆ ನಾವು ಹಂಗೆ RSS ಅಂದ್ರೆ ಬಿಡಲ್ಲ
ಅಂತ ಹೇಳಿ.
RSS ಅಂದ್ರೆ ನಾವು ಬಿಡಲ್ಲ. ಮಾಡಿದ್ದೀರಾ ನೀವು?
ಒಂದು ಆರ್ಗನೈಸೇಷನ್
ಮಾಡಿರೋದು ಅದಕ್ಕೆ
RSS ಅಂತ
ಅದರಿಂದ ಕಳುತ್ತಿಂದ ತೆಗಿಯಕ್ಕಾಗಲ್ಲ. ಅದರಿಂದ ದಯವಿಟ್ಟು ಸದನ ನಡೆಸಕ್ಕೆ ಅವಕಾಶ ಮಾಡಿಕೊಡಿ. ಸದನ ನಡೆಸಕ್ಕೆ ಅವಕಾಶ ಮಾಡಿಕೊಡಿ. ಅದು ಅನ್ಪಾರ್ಲಿಮೆಂಟ್ ವರ್ಡ್ ಆಯ್ತು, ತೆಗಿಬಹುದಾಯ್ತು. ಅನ್ಪಾರ್ಲಿಮೆಂಟ್ ವರ್ಡ್ ಅಲ್ಲ ಅದು. ಅದರಿಂದ ಸದನ ನಡೆಸಕ್ಕೆ ಅವಕಾಶ ಮಾಡಿಕೊಡಿ.
ನೋಡಿ,
ಪರವಾಗಿರೋರು ಇವರು,
4% ಮುಸ್ಲಿಮರಿಗೆ ಕೊಟ್ಟಿದಾರಲ್ಲ ರಿಸರ್ವೇಶನ್, ಯಾಕೆ ಕೊಟ್ಟಿದ್ದಾರೆ ಇವರು? ಅದಕ್ಕೆ ಕೊಟ್ಟಿರೋದು. ಪಾಕಿಸ್ತಾನ ನೋಡಿದ್ರಲ್ಲ, ಪಾಕಿಸ್ತಾನ ಭಾಗ ಮಾಡಿದ್ರಲ್ಲ, ಇಂಡಿಯಾ ಪಾಕಿಸ್ತಾನ ಹಾಳು ಮಾಡ್ಬಿಟ್ರಲ್ಲ ದೇಶನ ಹೊಡೆದ್ರು, ಅವರು ಪ್ರಧಾನಮಂತ್ರಿ ಆಗ್ಬೇಕು ಅಂತ ದೇಶ ನೋಡಿದ್ಬಿಟ್ರು, ಅವರು ದೇಶ ನೋಡ್ಬಿಟ್ರು, ಪಾಕಿಸ್ತಾನ ಮಾಡಿಬಿಟ್ರು.
ದೇಶದ್ರೋಹಿ ಕಾಂಗ್ರೆಸ್ಸಿಗೆ
ಧಿಕ್ಕಾರ, ಧಿಕ್ಕಾರ,
ದೇಶದ್ರೋಹಿ ಕಾಂಗ್ರೆಸ್ಸಿಗೆ
ಧಿಕ್ಕಾರ, ಧಿಕ್ಕಾರ,
ದೇಶದ್ರೋಹಿ ಕಾಂಗ್ರೆಸ್ಸಿಗೆ
ಧಿಕ್ಕಾರ, ಧಿಕ್ಕಾರ.
ದೇಶದ್ರೋಹಿ ಕಾಂಗ್ರೆಸ್ಸಿಗೆ
ಧಿಕ್ಕಾರ, ಧಿಕ್ಕಾರ. ನಾವೆಲ್ಲರೂ ಆಗ್ತಾರಂತ
ದೇಶದಲ್ಲಿ ಶಾಂತಿ ನಿರ್ಮಾಣ ಆಗೋದೇ ನಿಮ್ಮಿಂದ.
ದಲಿತ ದ್ರೋಹಿ ಕಾಂಗ್ರೆಸ್ಸಿಗೆ ಧಿಕ್ಕಾರ, ಧಿಕ್ಕಾರ, ದಲಿತ ದ್ರೋಹಿ ಕಾಂಗ್ರೆಸ್ಸಿಗೆ ಧಿಕ್ಕಾರ, ಧಿಕ್ಕಾರ, ದಲಿತ ದ್ರೋಹಿ ಕಾಂಗ್ರೆಸ್ಸಿಗೆ ಬಾವಿಗಿಳಿರೆ, ಬಾವಿಗಿಳಿರೆ.
ನೀವು 1942ನಲ್ಲಿ ಬ್ರಿಟಿಷ್ನವ್ರ ಜೊತೆ ಸೇರ್ಕೊಂಡಿದ್ದವರು ನಿಮ್ಗೆ
ಪಾಕಿಸ್ತಾನ ಯಾಕೆ ಪಾಕಿಸ್ತಾನಕ್ಕೋಸ್ಕರ ಏನ್ ಸಂಬಂಧ ಇಲ್ಲ. ಪಾಕಿಸ್ತಾನ ಪಾಕಿಸ್ತಾನದಲ್ಲಿ ಐತೆ ಬಿಡಿ, ಪಾಕಿಸ್ತಾನ ಅಂತ ಕೂಗಬಾರ್ದು ಇಲ್ಲಿ. ಇನ್ನೊಂದು ದೇಶಕ್ಕೆ ಅವಮರ್ಯಾದೆ ಮಾಡಬಾರ್ದು. ಹಾ, ಇನ್ನೊಂದು ದೇಶಕ್ಕೆ ಅವಮರ್ಯಾದೆ ಮಾಡೋ ಕೆಲಸ ಮಾಡಬಾರ್ದು.
ಏಜೆಂಟ್ಗಳು ನೀವು, ಬ್ರಿಟಿಷ್ನವ್ರ ಏಜೆಂಟ್. ಬ್ರಿಟಿಷ್ನವ್ರು ಇದ್ದಾಗ ಅವರು ಅವ್ರ ಜೊತೆ ಸೇರ್ಕೊಂಡಿದ್ದವರು ನೀವು.
ಒಂದು 10 ನಿಮಿಷ ಮುಂದೂಡ. 10 ನಿಮಿಷಗಳ ಕಾಲ ಸದನವನ್ನ ಮುಂದಕ್ಕೆ ಹಾಕಿದ್ದೀವಿ.
It takes a lot to get into a good engineering college. Providing the right teaching, infrastructure, labs and facilities is what determines a student's success and their future. Here we create engineers for the future. Jane, deemed to be university. Learn, experience, execute.
ವ್ಯಾಪಾರ ಹೇಗೆ ಬೆಳೆಸ್ತೀಯ, ಗಲ್ಲ ಹೇಗೆ ಬೆಳೆಸ್ತೀಯ, ಹೇಗೆ ಟೈಕೂನ್ ಆಗ್ತೀಯ,
ಇದು ಸಾಕಾಗಲ್ಲ ಮಗ, ಇದು ಸ್ಕೂಟರ್ ತಾನೆ, ರಾಕೆಟ್ ಆಗೋದು ಯಾವಾಗ? ವ್ಯಾಪಾರ ಹೇಗೆ ಬೆಳೆಸ್ತೀಯ, ಗಲ್ಲ ಹೇಗೆ ಬೆಳೆಸ್ತೀಯ, ಹೇಗೆ ಟೈಕೂನ್ ಆಗ್ತೀಯಾ? ಈ ಸ್ವೀಟ್ ಸ್ವೀಟ್ ಮುದ್ದು ಮುದ್ದು ಕ್ಯೂಟ್ ಪ್ಲಾನ್ ಬಿಟ್ಟು ದೊಡ್ಡದಾಗಿ ಏನಾದ್ರೂ ಮಾಡು ಮಗ.
ದೃಷ್ಟಿಬೊಟ್ಟನ್ನು ಹಚ್ಚುವುದರಿಂದಲೇ ಬಿಸ್ನೆಸ್ ಅಭಿವೃದ್ಧಿ ಆಗುವುದಾದ್ರೆ ಪ್ರತಿಯೊಂದು ದೊಡ್ಡ ಬಿಸ್ನೆಸ್ ಇದನ್ನೇ ಮಾಡ್ತಿತ್ತು. ಬಿಸ್ನೆಸ್ ಅಭಿವೃದ್ಧಿ ಆಗ್ತದೆ ಕ್ರೆಡಿಟ್ ನಿಂದ. ನಿಮ್ಮ ಅಂಗಡಿಯಲ್ಲಿ ಕ್ರೆಡಿಟ್ ಆನ್ UPI ಬಳಸಿ ಕಸ್ಟಮರ್ ಗಳಿಗೆ UPI ಅಲ್ಲಿ ಕ್ರೆಡಿಟ್ ಸಿಕ್ಕಿದ್ರೆ ಕಸ್ಟಮರ್ಗಳು ಹೆಚ್ಚಾಗ್ತಾರೆ ಮತ್ತೆ ಅವರ ಶಾಪಿಂಗ್ ಕೂಡ ಹೆಚ್ಚಾಗುತ್ತೆ. ಅರ್ಥ ಆಯ್ತಾ? ನಿಮ್ಮ ಪೇಮೆಂಟ್ ಪಾರ್ಟ್ನರ್ ನ ಸಂಪರ್ಕಿಸಿ.
ಮತ್ತು ಅಭಿವೃದ್ಧಿಯ ವಿಕಾಸ ಒಳಗೊಂಡ ಪ್ರಕ್ರಿಯೆ ಆಗಿದೆ ನಿರಂತರ ಮೌಲ್ಯಮಾಪನ ಅಂದ್ರ. ಇಲ್ಲಿ ಮತ್ತೊಮ್ಮೆ ನೋಡ್ಕೊಂಡ್ಬಿಡ್ರಿ ಕ್ವಶನ್ ಅಂಡರ್ಸ್ಟ್ಯಾಂಡ್ ಆಗ್ಲಿಕ್ಕಂದ್ರ. 95 ಪ್ರಶ್ನೆ ಅಂಡರ್ಸ್ಟ್ಯಾಂಡ್ ಆಗ್ಲಿಲ್ವಾ? ಏನು ಮಾಡಕ್ಕಾಗಲ್ಲ. ನಿರಂತರ ಮತ್ತು ವ್ಯಾಪಕ ಮೌಲ್ಯಮಾಪನವು ಇದು ಪಠ್ಯ ಮತ್ತು ಪಠ್ಯೇತರ ಚಟುವಟಿಕೆಗಳನ್ನ ಪರಿಗಣಿಸುತ್ತದೆ. ಎರಡನ್ನೂ ಕೂಡ ವಿದ್ಯಾರ್ಥಿಗಳ ಕಲಿಕಾ ಚಟುವಟಿಕೆ, ಸಹಪಠ್ಯ ಚಟುವಟಿಕೆ ಮತ್ತು ಸಹಜ ವರ್ತನೆಗಳನ್ನ ನಿರಂತರವಾಗಿ ಗಮನಿಸ್ತದೆ. ಸಹಜ ವರ್ತನೆಗಳನ್ನ, ಎಲ್ಲಾ ವರ್ತನೆಗಳನ್ನ ಅಲ್ಲ ವಿದ್ಯಾರ್ಥಿಗಳೇ, ಅಲ್ಲಿ ಆಲ್ ಅಂತ ಕೊಟ್ಟಿದ್ರು. ಓಕೆ, ಆಲ್ ಅಂತ ಕೊಟ್ಟಿದ್ರು. ವಿದ್ಯಾರ್ಥಿಗಳ ಸರ್ವತೋಮುಖ ಬೆಳವಣಿಗೆಯನ್ನ ಮಾಪನ ಮಾಡುತ್ತದೆ. ನೆಕ್ಸ್ಟ್ ಪ್ರಶ್ನೆ ನೋಡಿ. ಈ ಕೆಳಗಿನ ಯಾವುದು ರೂಪಣಾತ್ಮಕ ಮೌಲ್ಯಮಾಪನದ ವಿಧಾನವಲ್ಲ ರೀ? ಒಂದು ರೂಪಣಾತ್ಮಕ ಮೌಲ್ಯಮಾಪನದ ವಿಧಾನವಲ್ಲ. ಇದು ಲಾಸ್ಟ್ ಕ್ವಶನ್ ಮಾಡಿ ನಾನು ಕ್ಲಾಸ್ ಎಂಡ್ ಮಾಡ್ಬಿಡ್ತೀನಿ. ಇವತ್ತು ಆಕ್ಚುಲಿ ಸ್ವಲ್ಪ ವಿಷಯ ಲೆಂದಿ ಇತ್ತು, ಹಾಗಾಗಿ ಸಮಯ ಬಹಳ ಆಗಿದೆ. ನೆಕ್ಸ್ಟ್ ಕ್ವಶನ್ ಮತ್ ನೆಕ್ಸ್ಟ್ ನಾನ್ ತಗೋತೀನಂತ. ಇನ್ನೂ ಅದಾವ ಕ್ವಶನ್, ಬಟ್ ಬೇಡ, ಈಗ ಹೆವಿ ಆಗ್ಬಿಟ್ಟೈತಿ ನಿಮಗ್, ಬೇಡ. ಎಸ್, ಇದ್ರಾಗನು ತಪ್ಪು ಹಾಕ್ತಿದ್ರೆ ಹೋಗ್ರಿ ಆ ಕಡೆ, ಕ್ಲಾಸ್ ಬಿಟ್ ನಡಿ. ಎಷ್ಟ ಸಿಂಪಲ್ ಅದ. ಏನ್ ಕೇಳ್ಯಾರ? ಈ ಕೆಳಗಿನ ಯಾವುದು, ನಾನ್ ನಿಜವಾಗ್ಲೂ ಹೇಳ್ಬೇಕಂದ್ರೆ ನಾನು ಇದ್ರ ಬಗ್ಗೆ ಓದಿಲ್ಲ. ಇದು ಫಸ್ಟ್ ಟೈಮ್ ನಿಮಗ್ ಕ್ವಶನ್ ಮಾಡಿ ಓದ್ಸಾಕತ್ತಿದ್ದು. ಅಂದ್ರೂ ನಾನ್ ಬೇಗ ಕಂಡು ಹಿಡಿತಾ ಇದೀನಿ. ನೀವು ಇಷ್ಟು ವರ್ಷಗಳಿಂದ ಓದ್ಕೋತ್ ಬಂದಿದ್ದೀರಿ, ಹೆಂಗ್ ತಿಳ್ಕೊಳಂಗಿಲ್ಲ ನೀವು? ಹೇಳ್ರಿ ನೋಡೋಣ. ರೂಪಣಾತ್ಮಕ ಮೌಲ್ಯಮಾಪನದ ವಿಧಾನ ಕೇಳಿಲ್ಲ. ರೂಪಣಾತ್ಮಕ ಅಂದ್ರೆ ಬೇಸಿಕಲಿ ಏನ್ರಿ? FA ಗಳನ್ನ ತಗೊಳ್ಳೋದು, ಮಂತ್ಲಿ ಪರೀಕ್ಷೆಗಳ ನಿರಂತರ ಮೌಲ್ಯಮಾಪನ ಮಾಡೋದು. ಇದು ನೈದಾನಿಕ ಪರೀಕ್ಷೆ ಮತ್ತು ಪರಿಹಾರ ಬೋಧನೆಗಳನ್ನ ಒಳಗೊಂಡೈತಿ. ಹೌದು, ತಿಂಗಳ ಇದನ್ನ ಓಕೆ. ನೈದಾನಿಕ ಪರೀಕ್ಷೆ, ಈ ರೂಪಣಾತ್ಮಕ ಪರೀಕ್ಷೆದ ಒಂದು ತಂತ್ರ ನೈದಾನಿಕ ಪರೀಕ್ಷೆ. ಎಲ್ಲಿ ಸಮಸ್ಯೆ ಐತಿ ಅಂತ ಗುರ್ತಿಸ್ತದ್ರಿ. ಸೊ ಪರಿಹಾರ ಬೋಧನೆಗಳನ್ನು ಕೂಡ ನೀಡ್ತಾ ಬಂದೈತಿ. ವಿಧಾನವಲ್ಲ ಕೇಳಿದ್ದಾರೆ ಅಂದ್ರೆ ಇದು ವಿಧಾನ ಐತಿ. ನೆಕ್ಸ್ಟ್, ಇದು ರಸಪ್ರಶ್ನೆ ಮತ್ತು ಗೃಹ ಕಾರ್ಯಗಳನ್ನು ಒಳಗೊಂಡೈತಿ. ಹೌದು, ರೂಪಣಾತ್ಮಕ ಮೌಲ್ಯಮಾಪನ ರಸಪ್ರಶ್ನೆಯನ್ನು ಒಳಗೊಂಡೈತಿ. ಗೃಹ ಕಾರ್ಯಗಳನ್ನು, ಹೋಮ್ವರ್ಕ್ ಗಳನ್ನು ಕೂಡ ಕೊಡ್ತಾರ್ರಿ. ಇದು ಸರಿ ಇದೆ. ಇದು ಯೋಜನೆ ಮತ್ತು ನಿಯೋಜಿತ ಕಾರ್ಯಗಳನ್ನ ಒಳಗೊಂಡಿದೆ. ಹೌದು, ಪ್ಲಾನು ಮತ್ತು ನೆಕ್ಸ್ಟ್ ಅನ್ಪ್ಲಾನು ಎರಡನ್ನೂ ಕೂಡ ಒಳಗೊಂಡೈತಿ. ಬಟ್ ಆಪ್ಷನ್ 3 ನೋಡ್ರಿ, ಇದು ಎಷ್ಟು ಸಿಂಪಲ್ ಐತಿ. ಇದು ಸೆಮಿಸ್ಟರ್ ಕೊನೆಯಲ್ಲಿ ಅಥವಾ ವರ್ಷದ ಕೊನೆಯಲ್ಲಿ ನಡೆಸುವ ಪರೀಕ್ಷೆಗಳನ್ನು ಒಳಗೊಂಡೈತಿ. ಇದು ತಪ್ಪಲ್ವಾ? ಇದು ಏನ್ರಿ? ಇದು ರೂಪಣಾತ್ಮಕ ಅಲ್ಲ, ಇದು ಸಂಕಲನಾತ್ಮಕ ಅಲ್ವಾ? ಇದು ಸಂಕಲನಾತ್ಮಕ. ಇಷ್ಟು ಸಿಂಪಲ್ ಇತ್ತು ಇದು ಪ್ರಶ್ನೆ. ವರ್ಷದ ಕೊನೆಯಲ್ಲಿ ಬರುವುದೇ ಇಲ್ಲ. ಇದ್ರಾಗ ತಪ್ಪ ಆನ್ಸರ್ ಹಾಕೋದು ಮಾತೇ ಇಲ್ವಲ್ಲ. ಇದು ಕೊಟ್ಟು ಬಿಟ್ಟಾರ ಬಹಳ ಈಸಿಯಾಗಿ, ಇದು ಬರುದೇ ಇಲ್ಲ ಅಂತ ಹೇಳಿ. ಪ್ರಶ್ನೆ ಅರ್ಥ ಮಾಡ್ಕೋಬೇಕು. ಎಸ್, ಇದು ಮೇನ್ ಐತಿ. ಕ್ವಶನ್ ಎಕ್ದಮ್ ಸಿಂಪಲ್ ಐತ್ರಿ. ಇದು ಸೆಮಿಸ್ಟರ್ ಕೊನೆಯಲ್ಲಿ ಈಗ ಸದ್ದ ಹುಡುಗರು ನಡ್ಯಾಕತ್ತಾವಲ್ರಿ ನಮ್ಮ, ಅವೇ ನೋಡ್ರಿ. ಇದು ಸೆಮಿಸ್ಟರ್ ಕೊನೆಯಲ್ಲಿ SA1, SA2. ಓಕೆ, ಸೊ ಪ್ಲೀಸ್ ಈ ರೀತಿಯಾಗಿ ಆನ್ಸರ್ ಮಾಡ್ಕೋರಿ. ಇದು ಸೆಮಿಸ್ಟರ್ ಕೊನೆಯಲ್ಲಿ ಅಥವಾ ವರ್ಷದ ಕೊನೆಯಲ್ಲಿ ನಡೆಯುವ ಪರೀಕ್ಷೆಗಳನ್ನು ಒಳಗೊಂಡೈತಿ. ಇದು ತಪ್ಪಾದಂತಹ ಉತ್ತರ ರೀ. ಇದು ರೂಪಣಾತ್ಮಕ ಒಳಗೊಂಡಿಲ್ಲ. ನಿರಂತರ ಮತ್ತು ವ್ಯಾಪಕ ಮೌಲ್ಯಮಾಪನದ ಎಲ್ಲಿ 2 ವಿಧಗಳು ಅದಾವ ವಿದ್ಯಾರ್ಥಿಗಳೇ. ನಿರಂತರ ಮತ್ತು ವ್ಯಾಪಕ ಮೌಲ್ಯಮಾಪನ CCE ಒಳಗ 2 ಟೈಪ್ ಅದಾವ. ಸಾಮಾನ್ಯವಾಗಿ ಮೌಲ್ಯಮಾಪನದಲ್ಲಿ ಹಲವಾರು ವಿಧಗಳನ್ನು ಕಾಣ್ತೀವ್ರಿ, ಆದ್ರೆ
Full leg day feels.
सेनापति जी आपकी तलवार.
Take it.
सेनापति जी आपका पोस्ट वर्क.
Bring it. Muscle recovery के लिए I have badams every day.
Also backed by nutrition research.
So grab a handful of almonds every day.
बड़ी बहू, ये तुम्हारी ना. इतनी भी क्या जल्दी थी? अरे और छोटी, ये तुम्हारे नाम. और ये मेरी गुड़िया के नाम. पर दादी, हाँ आपके नाम?
सब कुछ मैंने बैंक, लॉकर, फिक्स डिपॉजिट सब में इन्हें ही तो नॉमिनी बनाया है.
कल जब मैं ना रहूं तब पैसे मिलने में इन्हें आसानी हो।
शुभ शुभ बोलो क्या?
आरबीआई कहता है
जानकार बनिए, सतर्क रहिए.
ಆಗ್ತಿರ್ತಾವ ಬಟ್ ಡೋಂಟ್ ವರಿ, ಇವಾಗ ಓದ್ಕೊಂಡಿದ್ದೀರಿ, ಇನ್ನೂ ಸಾಕಷ್ಟು ಕ್ವಶನ್ಸ್ ಗಳು ಇದ್ರ ಮೇಲೆ ನೆಕ್ಸ್ಟ್ ಬಂದಾಗ ನೀವು ಸರಿಯಾಗಿ ಉತ್ತರವನ್ನ ಹಾಕುವಂತ್ರಿ. ಓಕೆ, ಥ್ಯಾಂಕ್ ಯು ಸೋ ಮಚ್ ಫಾರ್ ವಾಚಿಂಗ್ ದಿಸ್ ಕ್ಲಾಸ್ ರೀ. ಮತ್ತೆ ಸಿಗೋನು ನೆಕ್ಸ್ಟ್ ಒಂದು ಕ್ಲಾಸ್ ಅಲ್ಲಿ. ಇದರ ಮೇಲೆ ಇನ್ನು ಎರಡು ಕ್ಲಾಸ್ ಬರ್ತಾವ, ಅವಾಗ ಡಿಟೇಲ್ ತಿಳ್ಕೋತೀರಿ. ಸೊ ಭಯ ಪಡೋ ಅವಶ್ಯಕತೆ ಇಲ್ಲ. ಒಳ್ಳೆಯದು. ಅಂಡ್ ಸಾರಿ, ನಾ ಏನಾದ್ರು ಅಂದ್ ಬಿಟ್ರೆ ಯಾರಿಗಾದ್ರೂ ಏನಾದ್ರು ಬೇಜಾರಾದ್ರೆ ಕ್ಷಮಿಸ್ರಿ. ಅದಕ್ಕೇನ್ ತಲೆಗೆ ಹಾಕೊಳಕ್ ಹೋಗ್ಬೇಡ್ರಿ. ಅವು ಕ್ವಶನ್ಸ್ ಅಲ್ವಾ, ಮಿಸ್ಟೇಕ್ಸ್ ಗಳು ಆಗ್ತಿರ್ತಾವ. ಓದ್ಕೊಳ್ಳೋಣ. ಓಕೆ, ಓದ್ಕೊಳ್ಳಾರ್ದು ಯಾವ್ದು ಇರಂಗಿಲ್ಲ, ಈಸಿ ಇರ್ತಾವ್ರಿ, ಓದ್ಕೊಳ್ಳೋಣ ಅಂತ ಪರಿ ಏನ್ ದೊಡ್ಡ ಮೇಲೆ. ಅಷ್ಟಕ್ಕೂ 1 ಮಾರ್ಕ್ಸ್ ಹೋದ್ರ ಹೋಗ್ಲಕ್ಕ ಏನ್ ಸಮಸ್ಯೆ ಇಲ್ಲ. ನೀವು ಮಾತ್ರ ಯಾವ್ದಾದ್ರು ರೀತಿಯಲ್ಲಿ ಪ್ರೆಷರ್ ಅನ್ನ ತಗೊಳಕ್ ಹೋಗ್ಬೇಡ್ರಿ. ಓಕೆ, ಟೇಕ್ ಕೇರ್. ಮತ್ತೆ ಸಿಗೋಣ ನೆಕ್ಸ್ಟ್ ಒಂದು ಕ್ಲಾಸ್ ಅಲ್ಲಿ.
Hello and welcome to First Post. With me is Dr. K.V. Subramanian. He is an executive director at the IMF, the International Monetary Fund. Before that, he was the chief economic advisor to the government of India. Apart from being an accomplished economist, he is also an author, and his latest book has come out. It's called India at 100, Envisioning Tomorrow's Economic Powerhouse. Dr. Subramanian, very good to see you.
So good to be with you here talking, Palki.
Congratulations on the book.
Thank you.
And let's start this conversation with your own story. You had a modest beginning. I believe that your father had to abandon his education because of financial hardships, and that is where you started from, and you've made it to where you have. In a lot of ways, it mirrors the growth of India's middle class post-liberalization, post-1991. How would you say the economic reforms some 30 years ago impacted your growth and your personal story?
So it's true, Palki, and I'm glad you brought it up. My father lost his father when he was 7 years old, and he could only go to school, finish school. He wanted to study more, but he couldn't, and therefore he made sure that me and my younger brother were 2 siblings. He gave us, education and ensure that I was the first person in our entire clan to go to university. So in that sense, it's been quite a, it's really nice. Every time I actually, I'm able to contribute.
30th August 2024 को अवनी लेखरा ने पेरिस में भारत के लिए गोल्ड मेडल जीता.
थैंक्स. और आप?
ओह, ह्यूज फैन.
नाइस. फिर तो आपको पता होगा मैंने किसमें गोल्ड जीता.
ऑफ कोर्स, एयर राइफल शूटिंग.
एंड एयर राइफल शूटिंग में सबसे ज्यादा इम्पोर्टेंट क्या है?
एयर.
इट्स ब्रीथिंग. जब मैं सांस अंदर लेती हूँ और जब एंड देन अ परफेक्ट शॉट.
वाओ, नाइस नेल्स.
थैंक्स. पता है मेरा टारगेट कितना दूर था?
10 मीटर दूर.
इम्प्रेसिव. और वो कितना छोटा था?
बास्केटबॉल हूप से छोटा.
स्नूकर पॉकेट से भी छोटा.
गोल्फ होल से भी छोटा.
एक मारी बिस्किट से भी छोटा.
Introducing Marie Gold, Avni Lekra's special edition. आपका Marie Gold, shaped exactly to the size of Avni's target. हर बिस्किट पे लगी है अवनी के हिस्टोरिक विनिंग शॉट्स की निशानी फ्रॉम पेरिस 2024.
वाओ.
अगर आप अब तक अवनी का निशाना नहीं जानते थे,
well, now you know.
Order the special edition pack on Swiggy Instamart and celebrate Avni Lekra.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to your vacation guide. Your suitcases are fully packed. Settle in with your fellow passengers. This will be a long journey with an unexpected turn. You will arrive at your destination in 50 minutes. On arrival, remain seated. All passengers will be guided to their exit. Things may seem unfamiliar at first, and you would have to make your way through the local crowds. But soon, you will get into the swing of the usual customs. After this stressful day, all that remains is for you to sit back and consider doing it all again tomorrow. Your place in nature, closer than you imagined. Shobha Sinia Island.
I think of him because it's in some sense living his dreams as well. So in that sense, I think the liberalization was a very, very, I would say, seminal moment. I remember reading about liberalization, sitting in the reading room at IIT Kanpur, and in fact, that was my first exposure really to economics, and drew me into economics. And I think there is absolutely no doubt, if you look at the macroeconomic level, it's made a big difference. I'll share a telling statistic. If you looked at the GDP per capita that India had in 1947 and now, it's identical. 9,000 rupees was the GDP per capita, in 1947, 3.3 rupees to the dollar. So it was about 2,730, which is exactly what it is now. That essentially, now in between, I think that's the story of liberalization. From 2030, we brought it to $300 per capita, by 1991. So lost, 9 times as much. And then we've retrieved that back now to 2,730 similarly. So just think about it, over a 75-year period, we basically, through the Nehruvian socialism, we managed to actually lose almost the entire of that economic whatever was left after the British left. So from there, I think from 300 to now 2,700, 9 times, increase in GDP per capita. That to me is really the benefit of liberalization. If there's one theme I take about, and actually which should resonate with everybody, all policymakers, is the importance of competition. What liberalization did for us is competition. I think no better example than the media itself. Think about the time when there was only one Doordarshan, where we used to tune in, and today, and I think the competition has brought out so much, right? So all of you competing, and really, healthy competition actually enhances capabilities. So that to me is really the thread that I want to, latch on to and hopefully resonate. And across the board, whether it's actually take our competitive examinations, industries, anywhere where there's healthy competition that builds capabilities that actually enhances overall welfare.
Right, and we do have the quota system, but that's a different sort of, I think, will need a full conversation on its own. Sure. The way you put it, from where we started in 1947 to the point of liberalization and now, you're also looking ahead.
Yes.
Your book envisions India becoming a $55 trillion economy by 2047, which is a very good goal to have, but very ambitious as well. And for our viewers, let me put this in perspective. The US is the biggest economy at this point, a little over 25 trillion. China is second at 17. We are 3.3 in 2024. Yeah. And you're saying we'll be 55 trillion in 2047. What is it that makes you so optimistic about India's potential? So I'm sure, Palki, you and the viewers would have observed, I always make any of my assessments based on rigorous data and economic analysis. Let me start by giving a couple of examples. Let's take Japan. From 1970 to 1995, a 25-year period, the Japanese economy actually grew in nominal GDP dollar terms by 25.6 times. In 1970, its GDP was 220 billion. By 1995, it was $5.5 trillion. If you take China, and I didn't give China as the first example because people will say that's not a democracy, but Japan certainly was. So China from 1996 to 2021 grew its GDP by 22 times. That is the power of compounding. Over a 25-year period, compounding really works. And what I am, talking about here is about a 16 times increase in India's GDP. And let me lay it out for the benefit of the viewers. If you take 8% growth, and I think that is where the ambition really is, I'll expand on that. 5% inflation, which is what has been there historic, if you look at from 2016 onwards, post the inflation targeting regime, that is despite COVID, despite the Ukraine war and the supply side problems. So I think it's very reasonable to assume, therefore, that 5% inflation should be there. I think it may be conservative, but very reasonable. So 8 plus 5, that's 13% in nominal rupee terms. Now, I estimate based on, the difference, change in inflation, that the rate of depreciation of the rupee going forward will be less than 1%. It has been about 3.5% historically, but I'll come to and I'll explain why. In the book, I estimate it's 1%. Now, because depreciation reduces the value in dollar terms compared to rupees, you have to subtract that 1%. So 13 minus 1 makes it 12%. Now, at 12% rate of growth in dollar terms, your GDP multiplies every 6 years. This is the rule of 72. So, 72 divided by 12, 6 years.
Over a 24-year period from 2023 to 2047, if GDP multiplies every 6 years, there are 4 doublings. That's 2 into 2 into 2 into 2, which is 16 times. That's basically what I'm talking about. And I'll explain this in even more detail. In 2023, India's GDP was 3.28 trillion. Let's approximate it 3.25. So the 4 doublings means from 3.25 to 6.5, that's your first doubling. 6.5 to 13, that's your second doubling. 13 to 26, that's your third doubling. And 26 to 52, which is close to the 55 trillion. Now, this is where the power of compounding can be illustrated. If on the other hand, GDP grows only at 9% in dollar terms, then GDP multiplies only every 8 years, doubles every 8 years. So over a 24-year period, you don't get 16 times multiplication, you get only 8 times multiplication. This is what, Japan and China actually saw. They grew at very high rates.
ಹೊಸ ಟೈಡ್ ತೆಗೆಯುತ್ತೆ ಟೀ ಎಣ್ಣೆ ಮತ್ತು ಗ್ರೇವಿಯ ಕಠಿಣ ಕಲೆ ಈಗ ಬರೀ 69 ರೂಪಾಯಿಗೆ.
SRK
ಟೈಡ್ ಆಗಿದೆ ಅಸಲಿ SRK ಸ್ಟೇನ್ ರಿಮೂವಲ್ ಕಿಂಗ್.
ಮಾಮ್ ಅಂತಾಳೆ ಈ ಕಠಿಣ ಕಲೆ ಹೋಗೋದಿಲ್ಲ.
ಹೋಗುತ್ತೆ. ಟೈಡ್ ಲ್ಯಾವೆಂಡರ್ ಫ್ರೆಶ್ ನೊಂದಿಗೆ ತೆಗೆಯುತ್ತೆ ಎಣ್ಣೆ ಮತ್ತು ಗ್ರೇವಿಯ ಕಠಿಣ ಕಲೆ, ನೀಡುತ್ತೆ ಲ್ಯಾವೆಂಡರ್ ನ ಸುಗಂಧ. ಟ್ರೈ ಮಾಡಿ
ಹೊಸ ಟೈಡ್.
Introducing new Iodex Active Muscle Care, now in a non-sticky cream form for sore muscles caused by everyday tiredness. With the power of 4 actives, it provides a warming sensation, improves blood circulation and provides fast relief. Iodex Active Muscle Care, fast relief from tiredness and sore muscles.
In dollar terms during that 25-year period. So we need to seek inspiration from that, and I think India can. If you look at historically, India has grown at about 7% in real terms. So 8% is a stretch goal, and I've kept that stretch goal so that we have that ambition and we can deliver that 8%. In other words, the rest of it actually is not as critical as the 8% growth. Let me just spend a minute on explaining why the rate of depreciation is likely to be lower. So if you look from 1991 onwards, the rupee has depreciated on average by about 3.5%. Annually. Now, this has been during a period where India's inflation has been about 7.5%. Now, one of the fundamental credos in international economics is that if a currency faces higher inflation, its value in purchasing power terms actually erodes faster, right? For instance, to explain, to make sure things are understood very well, if I have 100 rupees in my pocket today, with 5% inflation, I can buy only 95 rupees worth of goods or services next year. If you take the US where inflation is 2%, $100 worth of money in the pocket can buy $100 worth of goods and services now, but only 98 next year. So the 5% inflation is eroding value of the rupee much more or much faster than that of the dollar. When inflation was 7.5%, it was eroding even faster. And that is why one of the fundamental aspects, therefore, is that higher the inflation, higher the rate of depreciation. Conversely, therefore, lower the rate of inflation, lower the rate of depreciation as well. So a fall from 7.5% inflation, which is what has prevailed in the past, to 5% now with inflation targeting regime in place, will shave off at least 2.5% on the rate of depreciation, which is why I think actually the rate of depreciation will be about 1%, not 3.5%.
Right. You've done a lot. You've done your math, obviously. There are a lot of assumptions there also, and there are a lot of variables. When we're looking at a 25-year projection, then obviously a lot can change.
So let me just intervene. Actually, say I wouldn't say assumptions, Palki, in the sense that I'm building everything ground up. Not just that, I've also tested the framework for previous 25-year periods. Even, for instance, the 8% growth that I've talked about, actually in one chapter, I've devoted an entire chapter to looking at the investment rate that, what investment rate and what productivity can deliver. So everything I'm building it grounds up. In some sense, rather than sort of just being superficial and making an assumption about the growth rate itself, I am building it from more,
No, when I say assumption, of course, it has basis in your understanding of the subject and so on and so forth. What I'm trying to say is that even in the last 10 years, if you were to look at this 10-year period, India has seen stupendous growth. We've emerged as a force to reckon with on the global stage. But there have been challenges. There has been a pandemic, which no one could have foreseen, and the disruption was immense.
Tell me about it.
Right? There have been 2 wars, 32 conflicts at last count that we've seen across the world. We've seen climate crises, we've seen geopolitical tensions.
Indeed.
So there are challenges. As we as a country chase this 55 trillion target, what, according to you, is the biggest threat to India's economic ambitions?
No, I think that's a very good question, Palki. Let me again draw on the example that I gave you, of Japan. As I said, Japan's GDP multiplied 26 times from 1970 to 1995. Now, this was not a honeymoon period for the economy. There was the Vietnam War. There was the oil shock, which led to hyperinflation in the United States, double-digit inflation, and therefore growth was impacted. In fact, that kind of inflation the United States has not had ever since, even during COVID, for instance, and following the Ukraine war. So Japan actually managed to grow its GDP 26 times despite these challenges. I think there is an important lesson in there. If you take China as well, which I gave the example of, it's multiplied its GDP 22 times. It did that during this period where there was a global financial crisis. There was also COVID. So I think whenever one looks at a 20-25 year period, headwinds will certainly be there. Equally, there is also possibility of tailwinds. That's the balance that you have to keep in mind. I would rather not focus only on the headwinds. I would say there are both of them. From the perspective, because you've asked me about this, the headwinds that I see, I think there are a few. Certainly, climate change is one, and I've written about it. Therefore, there is the possibility of already we are in there, the deglobalization, and I think as a result, the impact possibly on some of our exports. And also, industrial policy actually changing tack in many of the advanced economies when they're facing competition. So those are actually, I think, potential, headwinds that India will have to face. But here I'll give you an example. Again, one more. So when I think about, the potential that I'm assessing about the Indian economy, I think about how Sunil Gavaskar assessed Sachin Tendulkar's potential in 1993. At that time, Sachin had played cricket for about 4 years and he had performed. Based on that performance, Sunil Gavaskar said, if he does not end up with at least, 30 international hundreds and 15,000 runs, I'll be very disappointed. In a similar way, based on past performance, I am assessing India's potential. No claims to be Sunil Gavaskar of anything, let alone cricket.
But you're saying India will be the Sachin Tendulkar.
India will be the Sachin Tendulkar of the global economy. And the important lesson here is, it's not as if Sachin did not face challenges. He had the tennis elbow surgery. He had to, bat at a different position during Greg Chappell's, so there may be self-created, there may be, other challenges. But I think
it takes a lot to get into a good engineering college. Providing the right teaching, infrastructure, labs and facilities is what determines a student's success and their future. Here we create engineers for the future. Jane, deemed to be university. Learn, experience, execute.
वाओ,
बेबो की शादी के लिए
ओह गॉड, अपने घर से करेंगे
मैडम। बस इतनी आसानी से बेटी के डेस्टिनेशन वेडिंग के सपने को स्किप कर दिया। सपनों को स्किप नहीं, सिप करो।
म्यूचुअल फंड निवेश बाजार जोखिमों के अधीन है। योजना से जुड़े सभी दस्तावेजों को ध्यान से पढ़ें।
I think the important point is he worked hard and creatively worked to overcome these challenges, which is what India will have to do as well. Any 25-year period will obviously not be just a straight line. There will be challenges, headwinds and tailwinds. But I think the important part is we should keep our focus on delivering that 8% growth, and across 27 chapters, I've laid out what are the policy steps we need to take. If we do that, I have absolutely no hesitation in saying that we can, counter those headwinds, utilize the tailwinds to deliver this ambition.
Yes, and since we're talking about challenges, we're meeting on the 7th of October. Last year on this day, we saw an attack on Israel, and that sort of set in motion events that have impacted the whole world. Yes. Now we are seeing an even bigger conflict loom between Iran and Israel, and the fighting that's going on in Lebanon. How do you think this impacts India, and do you think that a wider war in West Asia will be detrimental to India's interests?
Again, I think that's a nice probing question, Palki. So let me, give you a sense of why I think the focus on our own policies is really critical. And I gave the example of Japan and China, which actually focused on their domestic economy. If we take the various components of GDP, India's GDP. So GDP is comprised of, you have consumption, you have investment, you have government spending, and exports minus imports, or what are called net exports, right? About 60% of India's GDP is accounted for by consumption. 30% is investment, and the remaining 10% is basically government spending, with the net exports contributing a much smaller portion. Imports being actually higher than exports overall. Why am I saying this? I'm saying this to highlight that 60% of the consumption, that is domestic. Investment, actually, FDI is about 100, maybe 1.5%, maybe 2%. Even if we go to 3%, it's still a small contribution compared to 30% overall investment in the economy, and 10% government spending is what the government decides here. So, in other words, if we start thinking about it more rigorously, in my opinion, we end up sort of, I think, overestimating the impact of the global economy on India, because as you can see through these numbers that I've shown, that a large part of our GDP comes from domestic sources.
Yes, but we're talking about West Asia, which is an oil-producing region,
Yes.
and we are an oil-dependent country.
True.
We import a lot of it. So
True.
any disruption in the oil market has a direct bearing on our finances, both individual and at the government level.
Indeed, I think, but I'm saying again, if you look at it using these numbers that I said, right? So, I've looked at this. If you take, for instance, the impact of oil earlier, when for instance there was administered prices whether it was petrol, diesel, etc., it would directly impact our fiscal deficit. Now it does not, because those prices actually are passed on, and rightly so. So fiscal deficit is not going to get impacted by the crude oil price directly. What does get impacted is inflation, because you have, especially transportation costs can go up, and middle class actually uses petrol. But the component of that overall contribution to inflation is about 15% maximum. And so even if, let's say, if there is a $1 increase in the crude oil price, the impact on on inflation will be about 1/15 of that, or 6% or so, right? Of about 15% of that. Through that, the impact on consumption again actually is not very high. I think that's what when you crunch through these numbers and start thinking quantitatively, what I'm trying to say is that yes, these factors are there, but I think quantitatively they are not as important, and therefore as long as we ensure domestic policies are done well, I think we can tide over,
So governments cannot blame international disruptions beyond a point.
Indeed. In fact, actually here, I'll put far more onus, on the state governments. Because irrespective of the, political dispensation, since 1991, central governments have pushed on reforms. Some governments more so, some others not as much. But really the onus, when I look at whether it's on governance or on reforms, it is on the states. For instance, one of the things that puzzles me when I was part of the government, it used to, but certainly now, is that when the central government budget is presented, there's, a full set of attention, a full party and questions asked, rightly so. But why is it the case that, when state government budgets are presented, nobody pays any attention? There isn't a single media channel that basically goes and asks, let's say, the Maharashtra government or the Gujarat or the, Andhra Pradesh, Telangana or Tamil Nadu government saying, what reforms did you do? How did you enhance the, quality of life of the common citizen? Manufacturing, we talk a lot about manufacturing. Again, if you start analyzing carefully, almost 80% of policy relating to manufacturing is at the state level. Land, that's a state subject. Labor, good part of it actually is a state subject. Power, which manufacturing sector firms need, that is basically again states, because if they give free power to their farmers, it becomes costly for manufacturing firms. Ease of doing business, all the permissions that are to be taken, whether it's actually land permissions, environmental, all these are states. So what I'm trying to say is that rather than trying to always say, oh, the international situation isn't, let's say, as favorable, that to me is not good enough reason. If our state governments in particular.
Rise entrepreneur. Take that first step towards freedom. There's an industry that needs your disrupting ideas. It takes courage to do what you love. We'll help you begin your journey as a business, like you, dedicated to you. Submit just 4 documents and register your business with Zolvit in just 7 days. I know what it feels like to lose it all in a moment. One wrong move, one mistake, and everything comes crashing down. But comebacks are built on one thing: trust. Trust in your training process and trust in the nutrition that fuels it. That's why I trust Muscle Blaze Biozyme Whey, the first and only in Asia to pass blind testings by Informed Protein USA every month. The ultimate certification of accurate protein claims, purity, and safety. Biozyme is made exclusively in the company's own US FDA registered facilities, so you know exactly what you're putting into your body. No amino spiking, no heavy metals, no banned substances. Choose Muscle Blaze Biozyme Whey, Asia's first and only informed protein, tested and certified whey, built on science, trusted by 10 million consumers worldwide.
Can actually, pull up their socks, and we citizens need to highlight to them that, you need to start talking about reforms, and we need to ask questions. And this is something I'll, use your platform to also put the onus on a CII, a FICCI, or an ASSOCHAM, saying, why aren't you holding seminars basically after a state government budget together with the media and saying how many reforms were done? What is it? This is really critical because states now need to start delivering on reforms, and that is what will be really critical for us to be able to achieve some of these goals.
That's a point well taken. I suppose regional platforms do highlight it, but we could obviously do more. At the same time, I have to say that when the economy does well and the credit goes to the central government, when the economy is flagging or there are challenges, the flag also goes to the central government. That's how it works. Since
I concede that, Palki. I think that's rightly so. But, when you get, let's say, bouquets, you should get brickbats too, and that's a fair game. All I'm trying to point out is that, while the macroeconomy, of course, is a responsibility of the central government, there are aspects actually which are, the responsibility of the states.
Absolutely.
And I think it is really critical to make sure that, because responsibility and power are two sides of the same coin. When it comes to, for instance, things like GST or other aspects, states focus on their power, saying you're stepping into our shoes, which is they're exercising their power. Rightly so, do that. But then what about your responsibility? What about delivering on some of the reforms? And I think I have absolutely no hesitation to say that overall states have actually disappointed in the last 30 years.
Some of the states are doing very badly. Their debt situation is very bad.
Debt situation is very bad. But it is also because, we all people, we get the governments that we actually deserve. If we don't put the attention on the states, actually on asking them questions, the right questions, they will continue to do what they've been doing.
Yes, I think there's a lot that can be done in that sphere. We're talking about reforms. We talked about liberalization. You also spoke about deglobalization. That is what a lot of countries in the world are also now looking at. Looking at India, do you think the reforms and the opening up have made us more vulnerable to external shocks, or do you think that's the only way we could have grown?
So, this is an aspect of economics and general business itself. Risk and return go together. If basically we want zero risk, then we can only get the risk-free rate, which is, deposits in banks, etc. So in general, if we have to generate higher return in the form of, higher GDP growth, etc., we have to take some well-managed risk. I'm not saying basically throw caution to the winds, but zero risk is not the way to go actually. And, there'll be some exposure to obviously global factors, and I think Indian economy has become more integrated. But as I was explaining, earlier as well, by sort of decomposing the various, aspects of GDP, clearly the impact of the global economy on us, in terms of in the direct manner, is not as much. Yes, sentiments actually, and maybe in here as well, I think people overread the sentiments because they do not sort of analyze it in this manner, saying if 60% consumption, 60% is consumption, 30% is investment, and 10% is government spending, all of which are, mostly domestic, then it's maybe we're actually overreading the sentiment aspect. So I think there are some risks, undeniably, but as I spoke using the examples of, other countries, or Japan or China or even India, the way we actually encountered COVID, for instance, and the way we've come out of that, I think is indeed commendable. So there is enough evidence actually globally and in India itself that we should be able to tackle these challenges with sensible policy.
You're based in the US now, and in less than a month from now, the US is going to vote for its next president. It's being called a very tight race between Donald Trump and Kamala Harris. Do you think the outcome of that election will have a bearing on India's economic policy?
Very marginally, I think. If we, look at the governments in the two different spectrums, each one of them emphasizes different aspects. But overall, I think the simple fact remains that the US and India are natural economic partners. Of course, both countries are democracies. We are the largest democracy, they're the oldest democracy. So there's clearly a natural alliance there. And I think, mutual interest there is what governs these relationships. And I think if you look at over the last 8 years across two different governments, the strength of the relationship has only grown. So I don't see much of a risk on that dimension.
Even if it's Donald Trump, who has been fairly critical of India's economic policy, although he says good things about the Prime Minister of India, he's raised the issue of tariffs on imports in India. Do you think a Trump presidency potentially will put us at more risk?
I think the way what I'm trying to say is, while there might be some aspects where they may actually focus on, there'll be others where actually there'll be benefits. And I think it is true that the earlier Trump administration had focused on some of these aspects of tariffs, etc. But equally, there were also, other aspects where there was far more cooperation too. So I think, it net, there will be actually not as much impact, in my opinion, irrespective of whichever administration that, I'm a firm believer actually, like, if you remember, cricket captains, if you ask them actually a day before the match, they'll say, ask them a question about the opposition, they'll say that we are focusing on our team. That is basically what is my message. We should be focusing on our team. And I think extraneous factors should not be really driving much of our, responses.
China, our neighbor, has been going through a slowdown, and after brazening it out and not admitting that there was a problem, Beijing finally seems to
ಪರಿಚಯಿಸುತ್ತಿದ್ದೇವೆ ಹೊಸ ಅಯೋಡೆಕ್ಸ್ ಆಕ್ಟಿವ್ ಮಸಲ್ ಕೇರ್. ಅಂಟಿಲ್ಲದ ಹೊಸ ಕ್ರೀಮ್ ರೀತಿಯಲ್ಲಿ ಸಿಗಲಿದೆ. ಅದು ನಿತ್ಯದ ಆಯಾಸದಿಂದ ಆಗುವ ಎಲ್ಲಾ ಸೋರ್ ಮಸಲ್ಸ್ ಮೇಲೆ 4 ಆಕ್ಟಿವ್ ನ ಶಕ್ತಿಯಿಂದ ಬೆಚ್ಚನೆಯ ಸಂವೇದನೆಯನ್ನು ನೀಡುತ್ತದೆ. ರಕ್ತ ಪರಿಚಲನೆ ಸುಧಾರಿಸುತ್ತದೆ ಮತ್ತು ತ್ವರಿತ ಆರಾಮವನ್ನು ಕೊಡುತ್ತದೆ. ಅಯೋಡೆಕ್ಸ್ ಆಕ್ಟಿವ್ ಮಸಲ್ ಕೇರ್. ಆಯಾಸಗೊಂಡ ಸೋರ್ ಮಸಲ್ಸ್ಗೆ ತ್ವರಿತ ಆರಾಮ.
ಬ್ರೋ, ಒಂದು ಯಾರ್ಕರ್ ಹಾಕು, ಯಾರ್ಕರ್.
ಲೋ, ನೀನು ಹೋಗೋ.
ತಮ್ಮ ಮಾತನ್ನು ಕೇಳುವ ಇನ್ವೆಸ್ಟರ್ಸ್ಗಾಗಿ, ಎಲ್ಲರ ಮಾತನ್ನು ಕೇಳುವ ಇನ್ವೆಸ್ಟರ್ಸ್ಗಾಗಿ ಏಂಜಲ್ ಒನ್ ಫಾರ್ ಎವ್ರಿವನ್. 3 ಕೋಟಿ ಭಾರತೀಯರಂತೆ ನೀವು ಕೂಡ ಪ್ರಾರಂಭಿಸಿ.
Investments in securities market are subject to market risks. Read all the related documents carefully before investing.
Be doing something. We've seen some interventions, some stimulus measures in the recent past, and the debate is still on whether that's going to be enough. Do you think it's enough what they've done so far, and do you see China coming out of this slump in the near future?
So one of the aspects, and I think there's been a lot written on this already, is that there are some structural aspects that I think are at the heart of what we are seeing in China, and I think a key part of that is the demographic change that in the next 25-30 years, I think their working population is likely to decline significantly. Also, if you look at even in their growth phase, their GDP growth was far more investment driven. It hasn't been as much consumption driven. And I think the demographic change will only exacerbate some of those aspects. So I think the aspects that the Chinese economy actually right now encounters is more structural. And one would have to wait and see, how the responses come about, because I think these kind of stimuluses, I don't think really address the structural problems. They are, they're sort of temporary solutions that potentially can help in the interim. But without a fix on some of the structural problems, I think long-term growth we'll have to wait and watch. I'm actually not as sanguine about the impact of the policy response, because the optimal policy response would be one that focuses on some of the structural problems.
And how do you see the approach of the current leadership, both in terms of how they deal with the issue of wealth at home, big corporate players, that the Chinese government, their engagement and their interaction and the actions that some of them have faced, their engagement with the rest of the world? Do you think that also has a bearing, their politics and their policy has a bearing on the way the economy is moving?
As an economist, actually, I'm generally averse to talking about domestic politics itself. You're trying to ask me about international politics. I don't really have much of an opinion on their politics. But I think all I will say is that the economic aspects are what I think need focus at this point in time. But in any country, I guess the politics and the economics do combine.
Fair enough. That was a clear steering clear of the question, but that's fine. Do you think India stands to gain from China's slump in any way?
I think that's been the China plus aspect that has been talked about. India definitely has the potential, and India is benefiting from it, but we can do more.
Is it? How?
Yes, if you look at, for instance, manufacturing sector growth. Last year, if you look at the economic survey numbers, manufacturing sector grew at 9.8% on a GDP growth of 8.2%. So if you look at semiconductors, for instance, there's been significant growth there. But I think, as I said, actually we can do more. We are, a country that can actually provide an equal replacement for China. And I think that's where, therefore, the focus needs to be on far more on policy. Especially if you look at manufacturing, as I said, labor laws, which were passed in 2020. I think, it's high time now that the subordinate legislation is passed. States need to focus, especially land. I think whenever one talks about, when I talk to people who actually want to start a manufacturing firm, they always lament about how difficult it is actually, and how involved and complex it is to be able to, get land. And I think that is something that states have to focus on. And I think aspects of power and some of the transportation, there's been good, I think, improvements on some of these aspects. Logistics, I think our ports have started delivering. The turnaround times are much better. Our roads have improved significantly. But I think power cost still needs to come down substantially, because when you think about a manufacturing sector firm that wants to, let's say, set up base in India and wants to move away from China, then their overall costs have to actually be have to be similar to what they face in a China or maybe a Vietnam or a Thailand. And I think that's where we have to offer, and it's all the policy aspects, especially on some of these parts that I mentioned. That is where the focus needs to be. So I think we are benefiting. We have the potential to benefit even more, and that requires, I think, the onus to be on policy relating to manufacturing, where states in particular and center too need to move faster. For instance, if you think about it, and this is, many entrepreneurs have shared this, when they go to China, for instance, right? If they want to set up let's say a factory in some city, the municipal person, basically whoever is the head, comes with a file which is actually everything is taken care of, all permissions. Person just needs to see through and sign, and lo and behold, the factory is ready to be that kind of
that is not possible. We are a democracy at the end of the day, and it is messy, and we operate on the principle of consensus with all the stakeholders, which may not be the case in China. So how can we create our own unique model?
No, I wouldn't say that is not possible, Balki. I think it's difficult, but impossible is not a word that is there in my dictionary. I think what I'm talking about is, if not, let's say, having something ready immediately, but there can be a situation where, let's say, within 2 weeks, I think that's a very reasonable period of time where, and one of the main
ಹೊಸ ಟೈಡ್ ತೆಗೆಯುತ್ತೆ ಟೀ ಎಣ್ಣೆ ಮತ್ತು ಗ್ರೇವಿಯ ಕಠಿಣ ಕಲೆ ಈಗ ಬರೀ 69 ರೂಪಾಯಿಗೆ.
SRK ಟೈಡ್ ಆಗಿದೆ ಅಸಲಿ SRK ಸ್ಟೇನ್ ರಿಮೂವಲ್ ಕಿಂಗ್.
ಮಾಮ್ ಅಂತಾಳೆ ಈ ಕಠಿಣ ಕಲೆ ಹೋಗೋದಿಲ್ಲ.
ಹೋಗುತ್ತೆ. ಟೈಡ್ ಲ್ಯಾವೆಂಡರ್ ಫ್ರೆಶ್ ನೊಂದಿಗೆ ತೆಗೆಯುತ್ತೆ ಎಣ್ಣೆ ಮತ್ತು ಗ್ರೇವಿಯ ಕಠಿಣ ಕಲೆ, ನೀಡುತ್ತೆ ಲ್ಯಾವೆಂಡರ್ನ ಸುಗಂಧ. ಟ್ರೈ ಮಾಡಿ
ಹೊಸ ಟೈಡ್.
A healthy environment is important for students to do well. A place where they feel at home. Place where they are free to explore. Jain deemed to be university. Learn, experience, execute.
Aspects is the permissions. Right now, actually what happens is, especially at the state level, entrepreneurs have to often run from pillar to post to get every kind of permission, And many times actually, files sit in desks for reasons that we all know, and which must be attended to.
So red tape and corruption.
Yes, I think the combination of that, and this is something that I don't think we can or we should be saying that it is impossible to. We should at least be reducing. Maybe it's, making it zero. I think no country ever. I mean, we in every economy you actually get varying degrees of this. But I think we should definitely be aspiring to reduce it significantly and make it easier for our entrepreneurs. And as I said again, I put the onus on the state significantly, with also the onus on labor reforms. For the center, I think even capital, for instance, cost of capital needs to go down. These are aspects. If we do that, we will be able to realize this potential even more. There is a lot of potential, and I think time is ticking. We have to actually make sure that we avail these benefits and act quickly.
Yes, because for all the talk of de-risking, decoupling, etc., a bulk of the players are still going to, like you said, China, Vietnam, Thailand, and so on. And even in India, whatever we're doing is mostly assembling rather than manufacturing.
So see, there actually I have a nuanced view, Palki. I think if you look at not just in India, and I'll give you examples of India, but other countries too, wherever every industry actually typically starts with assembling and then graduates into value-added manufacturing. If you take, for instance, automobiles in the late 80s, when Maruti started basically manufacturing the Maruti 800 car, at that time all the components used to come from Suzuki and they were assembled here. Now, over the next 40 odd years, actually close to 40 years, the entire supply chain has grown in India. Similarly, it's happening with semiconductors now, and I think that is the case with, if you look at every export, a country that has become very powerful in exports, it has started with basically assembling and then, graduated into value-added manufacturing. It's like, if you have to learn to run, you have to first learn to walk. Otherwise,
so we're on the right track, you say.
We are. But I think speed. I think I tend to be impatient on these. We should definitely do assembling, but we should also have the aspiration to quickly graduate into value-added manufacturing. All I'm saying is, we cannot target value-added manufacturing right away without doing the assembling part. But it shouldn't be a reason for us to say we'll continue assembling all the time for the next decade or so. No, that is not. That's not how we will be able to utilize the opportunity that we have right now from the China Plus, focus.
The other thing is our own trade dependence on China, which has grown despite all the political and defense-related concerns as well. And post Galwan, we saw an attempt to limit Chinese presence, but we've not been able to really do that. And off late, there seems to have been a rethink with more opening up to Chinese companies, investment, visas, and so on. We've seen like a string of policy moves and thinking along these lines. Do you think that's the right path for India to pursue? Do you think that's the only option as things stand?
In my opinion, I think whenever we think about economics in our country, we have to keep the geopolitics in mind as well. So this is a very nuanced issue, and I think while some people will believe that there is no color of money, I'm actually not given to that belief. And especially given the episodes that you mentioned, I do care about the color of the money. So I would leave it at that.
I don't want to leave it at that. I want to ask you. Okay. So you think that we should reconsider our engagement with China economically, and we should look for options rather than, because this year in the budget and post that, we've seen a shift in that direction, that it's okay, let's work with them.
I think it's good to have a conversation, a debate on this, but I think the final thoughts on this must not be only about the economics. It has to actually factor in the geopolitical aspects as well. That is what I'm saying. If you say, for instance, just focusing on the economics, I think the solution might be one. But if you factor in the geopolitical aspects, then the solution may be different. And I think it's good to have a conversation. But my own view is that this is far too important for just economics to be driving, the answer to this question.
Do you think the rest of the world is sort of waking up to this? Europe, for instance, after a lot of back and forth and despite divisions that still persist, they last week decided to impose higher tariffs on Chinese-made EVs, and it is going to cause short-term pain and disruption to their own economies and markets. But they have, we don't know if they're going to stay the course. They have till the end of this month to decide. But they seem to be finally going down that path.
I think in general, and we were talking about this earlier as well, about the change in industrial policy or, some of these trade policy, even in the G7 economies. I think this is an aspect that I've been mentioning earlier as well, where, a few years back when some of these advanced economies were talking about some of the tariffs, let's say, that were, which were being put on finished goods, for instance. The thought that I had is that every country tries to do what is good for its economy, and India was doing that as well. It's not good to put on let's say raw materials and intermediates, because that hurt our own interests, economic interests. But I think finished goods actually, so that's a nuance to it. I think now countries are doing it, and that is sort of in some sense sort of vindicating what the
Morning, boss. Could you please hold this? 1 sec. Take. Thank you.
Genius is dangerous when left unchallenged. Download Hyrus.tech and find a job that puts your tech genius to work.
जब मैक्स प्रोटीन बार है तो हेल्थ से चीटिंग क्यों करते हो ब्रदर?
High protein, tasty and filling, natural ingredients.
प्रोटीन स्नैकिंग मतलब नो चीटिंग.
There's a nuanced approach that India took as well. I think overall, in the kind of geopolitical situation we are in, the interaction between economics and some of the geopolitical aspects actually is something that is here to stay.
Absolutely. The other advantage that India clearly has over others is the people, the talent.
Yes.
We could be the talent headquarters of the world. We talk about the demographic dividend, but without the right policies, it could be a ticking time bomb too. And the bigger challenge is creation of jobs. How do you think India should deal with this jobs crisis?
I'm glad that you asked this, Palki, because of the 4 pillars that I've talked about in the book, the second pillar, which is social and economic inclusion, is essentially is really it's capturing the importance of jobs for social and economic inclusion. Let me put it this way: if you were to wake me up at 3 o'clock in the night and said, "Hey, you're a policy maker, you think about what is policy for India," then tell me 3 things that keep you awake at night. I would say jobs, jobs, and jobs. Because we have a young population, and I think no better example. You started out with talking about my father. I use that as an example. If he had not, for instance, gotten a job in Indian Railways, that was a formal sector job. There is no way I and my brother would have been educated, and I wouldn't be here talking about the Indian economy. So I think a job lifts not only one family but generations, and I think the kind of stories that we have, not just mine, but many others. We know so many friends of ours who actually have had similar stories coming from lower middle class families. Actually, their parents, working in, let's say, in formal sector firms, were able to educate them. And I think that story needs to actually permeate across India. Sections of the population that are below the lower middle class, even they need to have such stories to, their kids, maybe 30 years later, should be sitting here and talking about these stories. For that, jobs, therefore, are by far the most important. And I think our policies, therefore, need to be geared towards that. I think, as I've already spoken about manufacturing, I emphasize manufacturing because, that's the way to create high quality jobs. For instance, to give an example, let's say, some of the let's say young boys that come to do housekeeping work, let's say maybe in our homes, etc. If they go and work in a manufacturing sector firm, they'll earn higher wages. They'll actually be much more sure about have job certainty. They'll get skilled as well, and that's the kind of progress that needs to happen in a widespread manner. Not just that, and that will also develop the confidence that the economy is working for everyone. I think jobs are really the way in which the sort of support for economic reforms is bought. Without jobs, without actually the common people really seeing the benefits of progress, especially through jobs, then you get this sort of tension between reforms are benefiting only a few, and that's why the emphasis on jobs and through jobs, social and economic inclusion is critical. Also, I think manufacturing is important because from an external sector point of view as well, as even if, let's say, India grows the way, for instance, an ENY predicts, which is 26 trillion. In 2047, I don't think that is, that estimate is as correct. But even then, there will be a large middle class that will get created. And this middle class will need, things like phones, refrigerators, televisions, all these consumer goods. And if you're not producing it here in India, we will have to actually import them from abroad, which will affect our current account deficit and thereby trade deficit and trade deficit, current account deficit, and so on. So it is therefore really critical, to focus on manufacturing and thereby create jobs in the economy. I think there is no other national imperative, in my opinion, at this point as important as jobs.
I'm glad we agree on that. Jobs are critical. What complicates this for policymakers is the fact that the job market is also changing. We've done quite well in the digital financial infrastructure. We've seen the benefits of technology, but there are a lot of unknowns as well, including AI, which is going to be a big disruptor. No one really knows what it's like, and we're calling it the Wild West. When you see the $55 trillion mark for 2047, how do you foresee the future of work?
Yeah, no, this is actually 3-4 questions loaded into one. So the first thing I have to tell you, actually, I think on jobs and employment, I've said this multiple times, the narrative, and especially the negative narrative, has run far ahead of the reality. And I think I want to explain to our viewers using data, high quality data. Oftentimes these negative narratives actually have been spoken about using the very poor quality CMI data. I worked with that data before, and that's why I say this. I've written a paper that is there on SSRN as well. For instance, just to give an example, even when positive news basically came, let's say from CMI, when I was in government, I would ignore it because I was not sure it was actually really, a news, or was it noise. Now, if you look at, for instance, high quality data that PLFS uses, which basically is what, the International Labour Organization had a report on the employment situation in India, which uses the PLFS, does not use the CMI at all. I think there is an important signal there. Or if you go by, for instance, the RBI report, which uses the CLEMS database, and from the vantage point that I occupy, actually, at the IMF.
Introducing new Iodex Active Muscle Care, now in a non-sticky cream form for sore muscles caused by everyday tiredness. With the power of 4 actives, it provides a warming sensation, improves blood circulation, and provides fast relief. Iodex Active Muscle Care, fast relief from tiredness and sore muscles.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to your vacation guide. Your suitcases are fully packed. Settle in with your fellow passengers. This will be a long journey with an unexpected turn. You will arrive at your destination in 50 minutes. On arrival, remain seated. All passengers will be guided to their exit. Things may seem unfamiliar at first, and you would have to make your way through the local crowds. But soon, you will get into the swing of the usual customs. After this stressful day, all that remains is for you to sit back and consider doing it all again tomorrow. Your place in nature, closer than you imagined. Shobha Sinia Island.
CLEMS database is available for several countries, and we know that data is actually high quality data. RBI being an independent institution using a high quality database, what do they find? They actually find that over the last 10-year period, leave out jobs that are created in agriculture, which is about 3.5 crore, 35 million. Even if we leave that out, 9 crore or 90 million jobs have been created over the last 10 years. That is 90 lakh jobs a year. I think if you look at the PLFS data from 2017-18 to 2022-23, each of the metrics, whether it's actually unemployment rate, whether it's labor force participation ratio, whether it's worker population ratio, all these metrics we are better now compared to, and even in terms of the quality of work, for instance, salaried class, basically that salaried and wage, who draw a regular wage, that has increased as well. So I think overall that's why it's important that this kind of data is spoken about, because it has not been the case. Many people say, oh, jobless growth. That has not been the case over the last 10 years. That's a response to the first part of your question. The second part, I think you talk about here, and that's a very good point. Here, I want to, refer our readers to a couple of chapters in the book. I've covered this in extensive detail because this is a fear that rests. There is a paper, and I cite that, written by two authors from MIT, Darren Ochimoglu and David Otter. They start out by basically looking at the US census data in 1960 and 2020. They look at professions that were there in 1960, what has happened to those professions in 2020. Now, over the 60-year period, there's been a lot of technological change that has happened. What they find, and I think that is quite interesting for us to remember, is that of the 40 broad professions that were there in 1960, only one of them is not there in 2020. And which of that is not there? It's elevator operators, because now it's automatically, every or three, four sectors have had some, change, like typewriters, for instance, now replaced by computers. But so the nature of jobs changes, but it's not that there's been significant job loss. Even, for instance, if you take something as common an example as ATM, for instance, right? When the ATM machines came, people said, oh, tellers will lose their jobs, there'll be job loss. If you look at it just as a snapshot, basically physical teller being replaced by the ATM machine, it looks like there is a job loss. But if you look at the entire supply chain, then it's not obvious, because ATM machines actually have to be produced.
There'll be newer jobs, is what you're saying.
Not just newer jobs, there'll be change in jobs. I think what technology does, it changes the nature of jobs. It's not obvious that it necessarily leads to significant job loss. That's the point that I'm making here. And I think when it comes to AI, this is where the difference will be. Every other technology that basically preceded AI really sort of changed the nature of blue collar jobs far more. But AI will actually have an impact on some of the white collar jobs. For instance, things like the software developers. I've been using ChatGPT now, for instance. ChatGPT, I just give instructions in English and it generates Python code for me. Or I can actually choose, if I want C code, whatever, I can actually generate that. So as a result, what you see is that the impact will be far more on white collar jobs. There'll be a change in the nature of those jobs. But I don't think, what research seems to suggest there'll be job loss as such. So in this area, generally, there's either people respond either complacently or people respond with sort of some fear mongering. But I think the reality is far more nuanced, actually is not as bad. There'll be transformation in the nature of jobs, but I don't think there'll be job loss as such. And from the Indian perspective, I think, I see as a significant opportunity here for two reasons. One, the kind of data infrastructure that we've created, especially through the public digital infrastructure, we have data and on various things, and that becomes a wonderful oil for AI to at the same time, actually we are a country which speaks so many languages. We have actually and use of AI can facilitate economic transactions which is across states as well, if we utilize that well. So I think there is an opportunity here that which India can utilize in an unprecedented manner, much more than other countries, given the sort of some of the enabling factors we have.
Right, and as we grow, our middle class obviously is expanding.
Yes.
But so are the challenges, inflation, taxes, and so on. And you've talked about it in the past about being caught in a middle income trap. How can India ensure that we break free of it?
So actually, what I've written about in the book, this is I think chapter 4 or 5 in the book. It's that the middle income trap is research talks about the middle income trap. And I remember, for instance, in 2018, when I'd taken over as the chief economic advisor, when there was a growth slowdown because of all the financial sector problems, there were a few people who said that India is hitting the middle income trap. I said, there is nothing structurally wrong, and India is not hitting the middle income trap, which is what growth actually clearly reveals. 8% is not, or 7% plus growth is not middle income trap. I think it's important to understand that the definition of middle income countries itself has been done is so broad. It's almost like from I think $3,000 to, or maybe even $2,000 odd to $20,000. So that's a very large range. Even if, let's say, a country grows its GDP per capita from about by 5-6 times, it still is a middle income country. In other words, if you make the definition so broad,
you need a healthy environment to develop great things. A place where there is freedom. Mentors to guide you. peers to debate with, facilities to test your limits, activities to bring out the adrenaline, and a place you can call your alma mater. Jane deemed to be university. Learn, experience, execute.
I know what it feels like to lose it all in a moment. One wrong move, one mistake, and everything comes crashing down. But comebacks are built on one thing: trust. Trust in your training process, and trust in the nutrition that fuels it. That's why I trust Muscle Blaze Biozyme Whey. The first and only in Asia to pass blind testings by Informed Protein USA every month. The ultimate certification of accurate protein claims, purity, and safety. Biozyme is made exclusively in the company's own US FDA registered facilities. So you know exactly what you're putting into your body. No amino spiking, no heavy metals, no banned substances. Choose Muscle Blaze Biozyme Whey, Asia's first and only informed protein, tested and certified whey, built on science, trusted by 10 million consumers worldwide.
That despite large growth 5-6 times, you still remain in that same bracket, then it becomes actually so tautologically, laying out the middle income trap, so, if you will. And I think it is also, I've shown in the book, if you look at the transition of countries from, let's say, lower income countries to, to low middle income or even upper middle income, there has been adequate transition as well. The thought that, India actually, or that the middle income trap is something that is a real, very, very large trap, and possibility of India getting entrapped there is very high. I don't think that is the case. That's point number one. Second point is, if there are some lessons, there are some countries that have been caught in this trap, and especially Latin American countries. I think there are important lessons that India can draw from them, and I've laid those lessons out in that. And I think what I want to highlight is that importantly for India, as our GDP per capita grows, as we become more and more developed, we have to continually refine our economic models. For instance, just to give a very specific example, now, the production linked incentives, PLI scheme is being used. And I think it's an important aspect because, from moving from the current equilibrium, where manufacturing basically policies are not as, amenable, to one where actually there's more enable. There's a bridge that enables us so that our domestic firms and other firms actually can focus on manufacturing. It's right for now. But, this is not something that should be continued ad infinitum. And that is important because what happens is when subsidies are given, I think it should be given at this point in time. But later, there will be a constituent that actually will, let's say, benefit from it, and they will protest when the, when the time is right for these benefits to be taken away. It should be taken away, and I think at some point in time. I'll give you an example just to illustrate this point. I mean, I'm sure you're a parent, I'm a parent too. If, for instance, somebody says, okay, my 18-year-old wants to go and wrestle with your 5-year-old, I will say, no way. Give me 13 more years. Let me equip my 5-year-old, and then he or she will go and compete. That's the aspect. That is what basically subsidizing domestic companies when they don't have the capabilities to compete with international firms. I think that is the part of of parenting. But at the same time, if my kid, for instance, knows that I will be there even when the kid is 50-year-old to take care of him or her, then he or she will never ever develop his or her capabilities. That's the other aspect. In a similar way, if for instance the private sector knows that these subsidies are going to continue forever, they will never develop their capabilities as well. So both these aspects of parenting, I think, are equally important for the government to focus on. On the one hand, when the domestic firms are not strong enough to be able to compete, handhold them a little bit. But that hand should be one, basically it should be reasonably loosely held with the expectation that it will be taken away so that the industry can become capable. I think that expectation that this hand is not there forever is a very, very important expectation to set. Much like a parent does, I think government needs to do that too. These are aspects. If we don't do that, then the risks of staying in a middle income trap is there, which is what Latin American countries, for instance, have. So in other words, I think economic policy has to be thought in this dynamic sense that what is good for the current state of the economy, the way where we are, that's not right necessarily for 10 years later. You have to move on.
Let me take your example. You said 5-year-old, 18-year-old, and then there are newborns like your startups,
yes,
right?
Yes.
And innovation and entrepreneurship is believed to be a key driver of economic growth. We had a very good scene going.
Yes.
Then post-pandemic, we saw some disruptions.
Yes.
People talk about a funding winter.
Yeah.
There is enough and more talent in this country,
Yes.
but there have to be some cushions in terms of policy and support from the government. What do you think can be done to help these players in India to insulate them from shocks?
So I think, see, again, a very nice question, which actually I'll have to answer at least in two. There are 2-3 aspects that I want to highlight. First aspect is that entrepreneurship in and itself, intrinsically, there is risk involved. I think that's the nature of the beast, if you will. So while, for instance, the policy environment can try and reduce some of this, and I think the focus on ease of doing business in particular is really critical. And I'll give you data here. If you look at, for instance, from 2004 to 2014, the rate of new firm creation, I'm using World Bank data to highlight this, the rate of new firm creation annually was 3.2%. This wasn't a period where there was actually adequate emphasis on ease of doing business, for instance. If anything, actually, it became more difficult to do business during that period, and that was reflected in, very poor rate of entrepreneurial growth. In contrast, from 2014 to 2024, when there's been far more emphasis on, ease of doing business, the rate of, new firm creation is orders of magnitude higher, close to 200%. I think that illustrates clearly how critical it is to focus on ease of doing business, because incumbent firms, the large firms, can sort of somehow circumnavigate, but new firms need things to be easy for them, and therefore one of the most important aspects that policymakers do is to ensure that for small firms, startup firms, actually doing business is relatively easy. Don't load them with a lot of regulation, and I think that's the most important, because that will also reduce the risk for them, because many times actually in having to move from pillar to post, they lose very precious time and thereby lose value as well. So that's the key aspect that I will mention. Now, related to entrepreneurship, and I think
ಇಷ್ಟೊಂದು ಕೂದಲು ಉದುರುತ್ತಾ? ಆಗುತ್ತೆ, ಇಲ್ಲ ಆಗುವುದಿಲ್ಲ. ಕಾರಣ ಬಿಡು, ಇದನ್ನು ತಗೋ. ಹೊಸ ಹಿಮಾಲಯ ಆಂಟಿ ಹೇರ್ ಫಾಲ್ ಶಾಂಪೂ. ಇದರಲ್ಲಿದೆ ಭೃಂಗರಾಜ ಮತ್ತು ನ್ಯಾಚುರಲ್ ಪ್ರೋಟೀನ್ ನ ಪೋಷಣೆ. ಈಗ 96% ದಷ್ಟು ಕಡಿಮೆ ಕೂದಲುದುರುವಿಕೆ.
ಈ ಯುಗಾದಿ ಸಾರಿಯಲ್ಲಿ ಹೊಸ ಆರಂಭವನ್ನು ಸ್ವೀಕರಿಸಿ. ನಮ್ಮ ಪ್ರಶಾಂತಿ ಜಯನಗರ್ ಮತ್ತು ಮಲ್ಲೇಶ್ವರಂ ಸ್ಟೋರ್ ಅಲ್ಲಿ ಅಪ್ ಟು 30% ವರೆಗೂ ಡಿಸ್ಕೌಂಟ್ಸ್ ಇದೆ. ಇಂದು ನಮ್ಮ ಜಯನಗರ್ ಅಥವಾ ಮಲ್ಲೇಶ್ವರಂ ಸ್ಟೋರ್ಗೆ ಭೇಟಿ ನೀಡಿ.
In the startup ecosystem is the innovation ecosystem as well. They're sort of, in some sense, Siamese twins, if you will. So innovation, and I think there's been again some very good momentum on this. Global Innovation Index shows that in 2015 we were ranked 85th. Now we are ranked 39th. So from 85 to 39 actually is a significant move. Much like in the ease of doing business rankings as well, which have been discontinued, but we moved from about 140 odd to 60s, and I think that's good. In this, I think the emphasis, the National Research Foundation that's been created, together with the 1 lakh crore, 1 trillion rupees that was allocated in this budget, I think that is something which is quite important. I will, and that brings me to the third aspect that I want to focus on here, which is the role of the private sector in innovation and entrepreneurship. So if you look at the composition of the R&D dollar or the R&D rupee, if you take India, for every 100 rupees that is spent on R&D, 2/3 comes from the public sector, 1/3 from the private sector. Same thing if you go and look at in the advanced economies, $100 that goes into R&D, 2/3 comes from the private sector and 1/3 from the government. So it is exactly flipped, and this is therefore a message to India Inc. for them to actually focus on innovation and entrepreneurship. They have to now have the mindset that they are basically on a treadmill where they have to continually innovate in order to stay where they are. They cannot be just basically myopic and say, I'll just focus on the profits here and now, not with the kind of entrepreneurship that is happening. If they don't innovate, their business basically will be taken away by startups. So I think the focus needs to be on for incumbent firms. In fact, one other idea that I want to actually lay out for India Inc., which is in the US, and in some of the advanced economies, there has been this phenomenon of corporate venture capital. For instance, you have, a Dell, let's say, creating Dell Ventures, others. Similarly, I think many of our, corporates need to create these venture firms as well, take some profits out. And that can be really important as well, because sort of carving it out and creating like a startup kind of ecosystem there. Some of the ideas there can be then onboarded onto their firms, and that can really help. So overall, I think the emphasis needs to just ease doing business, because that really reduces risk as well for startups. Private sector needs to start really getting into the into the R&D scheme of things. We have a few sectors, IT and maybe pharma. But other sectors need to start competing with it's not enough for them to actually just basically, applaud, saying that, our Olympians are the best, our, chess players are the best, our cricketers are the best. We need to start asking, and I've in fact tweeted as well, saying our industry needs to also start being best in the world. As they say, imitation is the best form of flattery.
Right. The other challenge, since we're talking about challenges and what we need to fix in order to achieve the goal that you've set for the rest of the country, is skill development. You spoke about ease of doing governance. That's something that this government at the center has been talking about from the word go. Skill development is another policy intervention that they say they've championed, but a lot more needs to be done there. Yes. How should India approach this? I think,
there has been effort on this, but I think the effort has not yet yielded the results that we would like. And I think the focus on demand side skilling, and I think the emphasis in this year's budget, there are some promising, avenues there, I think, which can be built upon, especially for instance, this internship program. I'd be watching keenly how that goes, because internship, all of us have actually done our internships. When we interned at a firm, we did learn some important skills, not just skills, but also how to work in the culture of that firm. And I think those are, if for instance, some, let's say a youngster now goes and works in a top 500 firm now, just the experience of working in a top 500 firm, some of them may get hired by the best ones will get hired by the top 500 firms. But these, interns actually can be hired by other firms as well. And I think in that sense, actually, it will be skilling that is on the job, and it will also be more demand driven, because the firm is, going to only skill the intern on things that they want, basically. And that's why it enables demand side skilling. I think that's the aspect that has been, in my opinion, sort of had been missing earlier. I think the internship program is certainly, it looks to be promising from the perspective of skilling being driven by demand side. Also at the same time, I would also, focus on the ITIs a lot. We talk a lot about the IITs, and I think IITs are important, of course, but the ITIs are as critical, because that's where the skilling actually for manufacturing needs to happen. And I think here a policy which brings together firms that will hire from these ITIs, they should be given the opportunity to set the curriculum, and maybe, a franchisee model as well. For instance, why shouldn't some ITI maybe called basically Firm X's ITI, or, so they get to set the, they said to, they have the opportunity to shape the teaching agenda there, and then they promise for hiring from there. So I think that brings in sort of brings the demand and supply together. Like that, I think focusing on ITIs, I think will be really useful for India to up its skilling game, because that's something that is really critical for job creation in the economy as well.
Right. A lot of India's neighbors are dealing with very high debt burdens, and they invariably turn to the IMF, which is called the lender of the last resort, for a reason.
It is the lender.
It is, right? So as an executive director of the IMF, what is your advice to these countries that often find themselves in the Chinese debt trap?
So I'll speak about the portfolio of countries that I handle, and I think the important lesson there is to make sure that good economic policies are implemented, and I think when debt is taken to do revenue expenditure or sort of give freebies, that is what typically leads to the debt trap. And I think this is where this nuance needs to be understood very well. If you look at India, for instance, right, during COVID, India did increase its debt to GDP. At that time, we had written in the economic survey saying that India's debt to GDP will come back to 80%. Why? Because that debt that was taken was to invest in capital expenditure. When debt is taken for asset creation, I think that is infrastructure creation, that enables growth in the country, and that's good. But if debt is taken only to, sort of provide subsidies or provide, let's say invest in, in ungainly expenditure that does not lead to value creation, then that is what is basically a recipe for a debt trap. And I think that's the important aspect that must be mentioned. And also, if you look at many times, when countries have taken debt to fund, sort of do revenue expenditure, there's also an aspect of governance that's been involved too. And I think that's an aspect that countries need to focus on as well. Overall, I think in general, managing the fiscal situation in a way that any debt that is taken is actually used for gainful purposes, I think is the most important lesson to take. Because the reason I'm pointing this out is, many times when you look at the narrative is, oh, all debt is bad. No, all debt is not bad actually. Debt that is taken, I think even at the household level, if I'm actually, let's say, borrowing to go on a vacation, obviously I'm actually sort of setting up myself for a debt trap. But if I'm borrowing, let's say, to buy a house, or maybe if I'm buying a car, for instance, which enables me to, sort of become more productive on my transportation, or a two-wheeler, if it leads to asset creation, whether it's at the household level or the country level, I think that is something that is good. And that's the lesson that, all countries need to keep in mind from the perspective of debt traps.
I think that's very sound advice. We've also seen a pattern of sorts emerge. When a country comes to the IMF, say in Africa or South Asia, the advice is to implement austerity measures, to cut down on the freebies and to increase taxes. But in the short term, it leads to more pain for the common man, who then protests, and it leads to political instability or challenges for the government of the day, which then focuses all its energies on being in power and retaining the seat rather than actually fixing the economy. And so a lot of these people start thinking that China is a better option because they're not asking so many questions. And it sort of becomes a vicious cycle. Do you think that the IMF could also relook at its approach? Do you think it's harsher with countries, especially of the global south, when it comes to dealing with their debt?
So, I can speak for the portfolio of countries that I am in charge of. And I think the important aspect that must be kept in mind is that many times, the medicine that is being given is medicine that the government or the government of the day should have implemented much before. Otherwise the problem wouldn't have happened. Think about it actually, where let's say, you became sick and you go to a doctor, the doctor gives the medicine. You don't blame the doctor for having given the medicine. And that medicine may be bitter medicine, but that is something that is required. You thank the doctor for having, diagnosed the problem and then said, okay, give you the medicine, and also said that you have to eat it, otherwise you're not going to get better. So I think, it's important that, as we were speaking earlier as well, many times these countries actually take debt to do spending that is not optimal, and that is what leads to these problems. And I think in the role as a lender of last resort, basically the fund, in the context of the countries at least that I speak for, is being a doctor that is basically administering the medicine that is necessary.
So you think the IMF should remain the dispenser of the bitter pill?
Well, so let me put it this way, right? Many times, when you want some tough things to be done, for instance, actually typically if we can prevent some disease on our own, we don't go to a doctor, we take care of that ourselves. It's only when, as they say in Hindi, pani upar sar ke upar se guzar gaya, when things have gone far too ahead, that's when you go to the doctor. And at that point in time, I think you need to take that medicine to be able to get well. So that's the way I would characterize this situation.
Right, but we are, like, I'm glad we could cover all the points that we did, and even if the IMF is doing what it's doing, I think your prediction for India, the targets that you stretch goal, as you call it, $55 trillion for 2047. I hope we have a conversation a few years down the line to take stock of how we progressed there. But thank you very much for sharing your thoughts and your ideas with us here.
My pleasure, Palki. It was thoroughly enjoyable having this conversation.
Likewise.
Welcome to this special edition of our Sunday show. It's 8:30 p.m. We are at the magical Grand Palais where world players will gather for a global AI summit. Good evening, Mr. President. Thank you for being here. And good evening, Palki Sharma. Namaste, Palki. We're going to do this interview together. Thanks for being here. This will also be broadcast in India. And just to have an idea, Palki, how many people generally follow you in interviews?
Namaste, and thank you for having me here. And namaste, Mr. President. How are you doing?
I'm fine. And Bharat ke logon ko meri namaste.
Kya baat hai. Thank you very much. And to your question, my favorite question, how many people watch? Typically in a month, we have viewers up to 150 million. That's more than twice the population of France. And in the last 2 years, we had 3 billion viewers. So I say, Laurent, this is your chance to be famous. You're on first post. But
and I'll try to be good enough.
We're very excited to talk about the subject that we've gathered here to talk about, artificial intelligence. You're hosting a summit. What do you think about AI as a policymaker and as an individual? Are you wary about what's coming? Are you excited? Do you think it's a threat? Do you think it's a gift to humankind? What are your views?
Merci d'être là et merci.
Thank you for being here, and thank you to both of you for giving me the opportunity to talk about AI. We are living through an absolute technological and scientific revolution, and it's almost unprecedented. So this is an opportunity for humanity. And this is something that I personally am following with a lot of interest. I'm convinced that it's a new era for progress, and that France and Europe and its partners like India need to seize these opportunities because they will allow us to live better, to learn better, to work better, to heal better. And I think that it's up to us to make sure that it serves humanity. So, before we talk about that, let's talk about positive things. Yes, indeed, because AI is already here. It's here in medicine, for instance, with research, with acceleration of research that's exponential. For instance, the early detection of cancer. That is a reality today in France, isn't it? Yes, it is in France and in the world. There's a bit of a race in that field. I see pictures here that you're showing. And a few days ago, I was at the Institut Gustave Roussy Cancer Center. It is one of the best centers in Europe, the 4th in the world, and we hope to become first thanks to our investments. And our researchers are cutting edge. We have collected a great deal of data, and thanks to AI, we can do prevention and preventive diagnostics as well. And I see this picture you're showing, which was shown to me just 2 days ago as well. Using MRI images, sometimes it took a lot of time to identify cancerous cells. And thanks to AI, because we're putting together so much data, because we have computing power, we can see things much more quickly. So for instance, a tumor, you can detect it more quickly, and you can more specifically target areas for radiotherapy. And so there's a lot to do in the field. You know, there's also the digital twin that I was told about. With all the data that you collect, you can create a digital twin. And don't worry, everything is being done responsibly by science. And the idea is to test whether a treatment will work or not. And you test it on your twin. So you see it on the left and on the right. You see how the AI is identifying the area that needs to be treated using radiotherapy. So this is progress, a concrete progress, and thanks to AI, in medicine, we can prevent better, we can detect things much better. Instead of having to do a biopsy or blood tests, and you had to do a biopsy several weeks after a blood test, now we can be much more precise.
Right. In fact, we have on the sets Oscar, who is using Wondercraft, piloting it with the help of artificial intelligence, and we would like you to tell our viewers about that as well. How does that work?
Wow. Ah, ça, c'est une entreprise française.
This is a French company.
Ça s'appelle Wondercraft.
Wondercraft, yes.
Regardez ça.
Watch this.
Et c'est l'intelligence artificielle.
And that is AI that is making all this possible.
Elle optimise.
Actually, it's optimizing it. So some of the images we saw are also French research at the Gustave Roussy Center with partners in Villejuif, in Saclay, big universities around Paris. And one of the companies was created by French people in the US, and I hope they come back to France. And what you see here with Wondercraft and Oscar, and thanks to Oscar for being here. I saw them 2 years ago. They're close to here, actually, based in Rue de Rivoli. The exoskeleton is mechanical, and you have a remote control on the side. So what's the role of AI? Well, it has computing power which assists the skeleton, and because they've put so much data in there, and because their processors are of such good quality, they can recontextualize continuously and improve the capacity of the exoskeleton. It is consistently optimized, and it understands how he's walking, and it also understands the environment that he's in. So what's important to understand is that AI is actually technology which will allow people, using their enormous computing power and their ability to manage huge data sets, that they will be able to train and will be able to optimize mechanics. Palki, here, as in France, would you say that in India people are worried about AI?
I think people are excited. AI adoption in India is high. But there are concerns, of course, just like in France, there are concerns about job losses. What will it do to the job market? There are concerns about misinformation, about copyright violations, about intellectual property rights. So that is my question to you then. How, as a policymaker, how are you going to address those concerns? Who will make the rules to regulate AI, and who will enforce those rules?
Well, the first thing, before I get to that, is that first of all, we need to be a part of the race. And for me, one of the main messages, and I think we'll come back to that when we think about the geopolitics of innovation, before you regulate, you have to say, well, we want to be a part of this. We want to invent solutions and technologies, and we want to create our own. We don't want to be dependent on others. But so, what about people who say that the best worker ever is actually going to be an AI? Well, that's not true. That's not true. That's also something that will disrupt the labor market. You have to think of them as assistants. AI will not replace humans. I don't think so. I don't believe in that. It's a technology change, and now we have these generative models, language models. But it's been decades that we've actually had AI, but